Hello there. Thank you for being here tonight. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe the day still hangs around a little. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're exploring a question that sits at the very heart of ancient astronaut theory. Not whether beings from another world created us, not whether they'll return, but something more immediate, more intimate. Did they walk among us? Did the Anunnaki, those beings from Mesopotamian texts, did they actually live alongside early humans in ancient Sumer? Did gods move through the streets of Ur and Eridu? Did they speak, eat, build, teach? Or were they always what mainstream scholars say they were? Deities imagined by people trying to make sense of existence? Where are you listening from tonight, I wonder? I hope you've found somewhere comfortable. This is different from asking whether ancient astronauts exist in theory. This is asking whether they existed in practice, whether there was a time 5,000 years ago, 6,000, when beings from elsewhere walked the Earth as physical presence, when humans and Anunnaki shared space, shared time, shared the dust and heat of southern Mesopotamia, when encounter wasn't mythology but daily reality, when gods weren't believed in but known, seen, touched perhaps, present. The question matters because it's testable, theoretically testable. If beings walked among humans, if they lived in cities, if they built temples and taught writing and ruled as kings, they should have left traces, evidence, something physical, something undeniable. Archaeology should find them, and either it does or it doesn't. The answer should be in the ground, in the tablets, in the ruins, somewhere between what ancient texts claim and what modern excavation reveals. The truth waits. If you're inclined, a like or subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps this space find others who might need it. But no pressure. You're here now. That's what matters. Now settle in. Feel whatever's around you. Let your breath slow. Picture ancient Mesopotamia. Not the desert it is today, but the land it was 5,000 years ago. Green, lush in places, the Tigris and Euphrates flowing strong, marshlands spreading between the rivers, cities rising from the plain, Uruk, Eridu, the first cities humanity built, the first writing, the first ziggurats reaching toward heaven. And in those cities, in those temples, in those palaces, were there others? Beings who weren't quite human? Who knew things humans didn't? Who came from elsewhere? The Sumerians said yes. Their texts describe the Anunnaki, divine beings, offspring of heaven and earth, present, active, involved. The texts name them, describe their actions, their relationships, their decisions. The Anunnaki judged, governed, received offerings, inhabited temples. According to the texts, they were there, real, present, as real as the kings who served them, as real as the priests who maintained their temples, as real as the scribes who wrote about them in clay that survives today. But modern archaeology says, well, maybe not. Maybe the texts describe belief, theology, mythology. Maybe the Anunnaki were always gods in the religious sense, beings humans believed in, prayed to, built temples for, but never actually encountered, never physically met. The temples were built, the offerings were made, the texts were written. But the gods themselves? Perhaps they existed only in human imagination, in faith, in the stories we tell to make sense of power and mystery and the forces we can't control. So who's right? The ancient texts that describe physical presence, or modern scholarship that interprets presence as belief? Did the Anunnaki walk among early humans in Sumer? Or have we misunderstood what the Sumerians meant when they said their gods were real? Take a breath. The journey begins not with answers but with evidence, with what we can actually know, with tablets pressed into clay and fired hard, with temples excavated from tells, with artifacts that speak but don't always speak clearly, with the gap between what ancient peoples claimed and what archaeology reveals. We'll explore both sides, both possibilities. We'll look at what believers see and what skeptics say. We'll examine the evidence for presence and the silence where evidence should be but isn't. We won't resolve the question tonight. Can't. The mystery is too deep. the evidence too ambiguous, the gap between ancient claim and modern verification too wide. But we can explore, can wonder, can hold both possibilities and see where they lead, can imagine what it would mean if the answer is yes, and what it would mean if the answer is no, and what it might mean that we're still asking 5,000 years later, still looking at the same ruins, still reading the same tablets, still trying to determine whether gods were visitors or inventions, whether the Anunnaki walked among us or whether we walked alone, believing we were accompanied when we never were. The clay waits in museums, the ruins wait beneath Iraqi soil, and the question waits in that space between belief and evidence, between ancient testimony and modern doubt, between what the Sumerians saw, or thought they saw, or said they saw, and what we can verify today. The question of presence, of physical reality, of whether 5,000 years ago, in cities that still exist as mounds of brick, beings from elsewhere walked among our ancestors and changed everything, or whether humans did it all ourselves and credited others. Either answer is remarkable. Either answer changes how we see ourselves. And perhaps that's why the question persists, why we keep asking, why the mystery won't quite resolve, because maybe what matters isn't the answer, but what asking reveals about who we are and what we need to believe. Long before the Anunnaki had names, long before temples rose or cities spread across the plain, the land that would become Sumer was water, not ocean, but marshland, wetland, a vast network of channels and reeds and shallow pools stretching between two rivers that flowed from northern mountains to southern sea. This was 10,000 years ago, 12,000 perhaps, when the last ice age was ending and the world was transforming, when glaciers melted and sea levels rose and climates shifted, when the earth itself was resettling into patterns that would define the next 10 millennia. The air smelled different then, thick with moisture, with the green scent of growing things, with water that didn't evaporate as quickly as it does now. The temperature was cooler than today's brutal heat, more temperate, the kind of climate where life flourishes, where plants grow without constant irrigation, where animals gather because resources are abundant. The land wasn't desert, wasn't the dry expanse we see now when we look at southern Iraq. It was fertile, lush in places, the kind of landscape that invites settlement. That makes agriculture possible. That allows humans to stop wandering and start staying. The Tigris and Euphrates flowed with purpose. Strong currents, deep channels. They carried snowmelt from Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains, carried silt that would build the plain, carried nutrients that would make the soil rich. Between the rivers, in the spaces where water spread thin, marshes formed, reed beds, shallow lakes, habitat for fish and birds, and the early peoples who learned to live in relationship with water. This was not land you farmed easily. Not yet. This was land you harvested, where you caught fish and hunted waterfowl and gathered reeds for building, where you moved with the seasons and the water levels and the migrations of the creatures you depended on. Perhaps it's hard to imagine now. The desert has claimed so much. The rivers are diminished, dammed upstream, diverted for agriculture. The marshes that once covered thousands of square kilometers are mostly gone, drained, dried, victims of modern engineering and political decisions. But 10,000 years ago, before any of that, the land was water and green and life. The stage was being set. The conditions were aligning. The place where civilization would emerge was preparing itself, slowly, patiently, through processes that take millennia to unfold. The stars overhead were the same stars we see today, barely shifted. The constellations the Sumerians would later name and track. Those patterns were already there. Orion, the bull, the lion, the same sky, the same celestial reference points. But no one was watching them with intention yet. No one was tracking their movements or calculating their returns. The sky was just sky. Beautiful perhaps, mysterious certainly, but not yet codified. Not yet transformed into calendar or mythology or the complex astronomical system the Mesopotamians would develop. Just stars, shining on a world in transition. Take a breath here. Let that landscape settle. When the climate continued warming, when the Ice Age released its final grip, the sea level stabilized, The coastline found its modern position, the Persian Gulf took its current shape, and the rivers, no longer cutting through exposed continental shelf, began depositing their silt in the delta region, building land, creating the alluvial plain that would become southern Mesopotamia. This process is still happening, still active. The land at the head of the Gulf is newer than the civilizations it would host. Some of it formed after Sumer fell, after Akkad and Babylon and all the rest. The earth is patient, builds on timescales that dwarf human history. Around 10,000 BCE, perhaps earlier, humans began settling the region, not building cities, not yet, but establishing camps that became seasonal villages, learning the rhythms of the place, where fish spawned, when birds migrated, how high water rose during spring floods, how low it fell in summer. The knowledge accumulated slowly, generation after generation, passed through observation and teaching, through trial and error, through the quiet, persistent adaptation that humans excel at. The people who would become Sumerians, or who would be conquered by Sumerians, or who would merge with incoming populations to create Sumerian culture. They were learning the land, making relationship with it, becoming indigenous to Mesopotamia. By 8000 BCE, agriculture was emerging, not invented here. That happened earlier in the Levant and Anatolia, but spreading, being adopted, being adapted to local conditions. Wheat and barley, legumes, domesticated animals. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming is perhaps humanity's most significant transformation. Changes everything, creates surplus, enables specialization, allows some people to do things other than procure food, allows priests and craftsmen, and eventually scribes and kings. Agriculture is the foundation, the prerequisite for civilization. And it was taking root in the marshlands between the rivers. The villages grew, became more permanent. Mud brick replaced reed construction in some places. Storage pits appeared, evidence of planning for future, of accumulating resources across seasons, of investing in place rather than moving with resources. The transition was gradual, not revolutionary. No single generation said, "Now we are different." But over centuries, over millennia, the change accumulated. The people became more settled, more invested in specific locations, more dependent on cultivated crops and domesticated animals rather than wild resources. The land was being shaped by human hands, and humans were being shaped by the land, by the commitment to stay, to build, to invest in futures that extended beyond individual lifetimes. Perhaps around 6500 BCE, the Ubaid period begins. This is when archaeology finds the first clear cultural identity, pottery styles, architectural forms, burial practices, the markers that let us say, this is a distinct culture. The Ubaid people, whoever they were, whatever languages they spoke, they built the foundation. They created the settlements that would become cities. They established the patterns of life that would define Mesopotamian civilization for 3,000 years. They may have worshipped gods, probably did, but we don't know the names yet, don't have texts, don't have clear religious iconography. The divine realm exists, if it exists, in silence, in practices we can't fully reconstruct from artifacts alone. The stage is set, the land is fertile, the climate is favourable, the people are settling, farming, building, specializing. The conditions for civilization are aligning, not because anyone planned it, not because outside forces directed it, but because geography and climate and human ingenuity create possibilities. And when possibilities exist, humans tend to explore them, tend to push toward complexity, tend to build bigger, organize more elaborately, create systems that allow more people to live together in denser concentrations. The first cities are still millennia away, but the trajectory is established, the pattern is beginning, and the land between the rivers is ready. Ready for whatever comes next, ready for the emergence of something unprecedented, ready, perhaps, for gods to walk among humans, or for humans to create gods in their own image and claim they walked among us. The land doesn't know which story is true, just provides the stage where the story, whichever story it is, can unfold. When the sun set over the marshlands, when the work of the day was finished and darkness settled over the villages, the first farmers looked up. This was 6,000 years ago, 7,000 perhaps, the Ubaid period. The long, slow centuries when settlement became permanent and agriculture became foundation, and the patterns that would define Mesopotamian life were being established. And in those quiet evenings, when fires burned low and children slept and the day's exhaustion pulled at bodies, people looked at the sky. The stars were brilliant then. No city lights, no artificial glow, just darkness and stars and the vast sweep of the Milky Way across the heavens. The moon moved through its phases, new to crescent to full to crescent to dark, marking time, providing calendar that everyone could read. The planets wandered among the fixed stars, Venus bright in evening or morning, Mars red and steady, Jupiter serene, Saturn slow. These movements meant something, had to mean something. The sky was too regular, too patterned, too consistent in its changes to be random. Surely someone was up there. Surely the movements were deliberate. Surely the lights were watching. Perhaps this is when the gods began. Not as abstract concepts, not as philosophical constructs, but as presences felt in the vast indifference of the cosmos, as the intelligence people sensed when they watched the sky behave with such regularity, such precision, such apparent intention. The sky moved like something alive, like something conscious, like something that knew what it was doing. And if it knew, if it had intention, then it had mind, had personality, had identity. The gods, whoever they would become, whatever names they would acquire, perhaps they began as the felt presence of order in the heavens, as the awareness that something larger was happening, something humans were part of but didn't control. The villages of the Ubaid period were small by later standards, a few hundred people perhaps, clustered around water sources, built of mud brick that dissolved back into earth when abandoned. But within those villages, complexity was growing, not just in population but in social structure, in specialization. Some people were becoming priests, or proto-priests, people who tended shrines, who performed rituals, who mediated between the community and whatever forces governed existence. The earliest temples date to this period, not the massive ziggurats of later times, but small structures, raised platforms, dedicated spaces where offerings were made, where the sacred was acknowledged, where humans reached towards something beyond themselves. The shrine at Eridu is among the earliest, built and rebuilt, generation after generation adding to what came before. The archaeologists found layers, 17 layers, each one a temple built atop the ruins of the previous temple, each generation maintaining the sacred space, investing in continuity, ensuring that whatever the shrine connected to, whatever it housed or honored or enabled, that connection persisted. This is remarkable. This is commitment across centuries, across changes in pottery styles and building techniques and perhaps even language. The shrine persisted. The sacred location remained sacred. Through whatever upheavals happened in daily life, the temple space was maintained. Take a breath. Rest with that continuity. What were they worshipping? We don't know. The Ubaid period predates writing. We have architecture. We have offerings. Fish bones found in shrine contexts. Evidence that marsh resources were being dedicated to divine purposes. But names, identities, theological frameworks, those came later. Or if they existed in speech and ritual and stories told around fires, in the oral tradition that leaves no archaeological trace. The gods may have had names, may have had personalities and relationships and mythological histories, but we can't access that, can only see the devotion, the commitment, the careful maintenance of sacred space, the evidence that something was being honoured, repeatedly, persistently, for centuries before anyone wrote anything down. Perhaps this is when the Anunnaki concept began, not as fully formed theology, not as detailed mythology, but as the recognition that divine realm was multiple, that there were many powers, many presences, many aspects of existence that exceeded human understanding and required acknowledgement. The word Anunnaki, when it appears in later texts, means something like offspring of heaven and earth, the children of the sky god and Ki, the earth goddess, the divine beings who bridge celestial and terrestrial realms, who belong to both, who mediate between. Maybe that concept, that understanding of divine multiplicity and cosmic connection, maybe that was already forming. In the minds of Ubaid priests who watched stars and tended shrines and tried to make sense of forces they couldn't control, maybe the theological framework that would later be codified in writing, maybe it was being developed in these centuries, refined through ritual practice, through observing what worked and what didn't, through the slow accumulation of religious technology that every society develops, ways of relating to mystery, ways of organizing relationship with powers beyond human scale. Or maybe not. Maybe the Ubaid religion was something entirely different, something that later Sumerians would replace, would overwrite with their own gods and stories. Maybe the continuity is architectural but not theological. Maybe what was worshipped changed, even as where it was worshipped remained constant. We're projecting backward, reading later evidence into earlier periods, assuming continuity that might not exist. The silence of the pre-literate period allows speculation but doesn't confirm it, doesn't validate any particular interpretation, just sits there, holding possibilities without resolving them. What we do know is this: by the late Ubaid period, by 4500 BCE, the foundations were laid. Villages were becoming small towns. Agriculture was intensified. Irrigation systems were being developed. Social complexity was increasing. Religious architecture was established. The pattern was set. And the next phase, the Uruk period, would explode, would transform scattered agricultural villages into the first true cities, would create writing and bureaucracy and monumental architecture, would codify the gods and name them and build massive temples for them, would create the context where the question becomes urgent, where we can finally ask, were the Anunnaki real? Did they walk among these people? Because suddenly there are texts, there are detailed descriptions, there are claims that can be examined, the silence breaks, and with writing comes the possibility of verification, or the possibility of deeper confusion, depending on what you believe, depending on how you read the evidence that's about to emerge. The stars that watch the Ubaid farmers watch them, those stars were patient, are patient still. They witnessed what came next, the transformation, the emergence, the moment when villages became cities and gods acquired names and civilization began in earnest. And whether what the stars witnessed was human invention or alien intervention, whether the Anunnaki were about to walk among humans or humans were about to imagine they had, the stage was set, the world was ready, and Mesopotamian history was about to begin. When the Uruk period began, around 4000 BCE, something changed, not gradually this time, not the slow accumulation of the previous millennia, but rapidly, dramatically. In just a few centuries, villages that had held hundreds became cities holding thousands, tens of thousands. The scale shifted, the complexity exploded, and with it, the gods became specific, acquired names, personalities, relationships, mythologies. The Anunnaki emerged from whatever they had been before into documented presence, into textual reality, into the historical record where we can actually examine them. The city of Uruk, modern Warqa in southern Iraq, was the first true city, not just large village, but urban centre, with monumental architecture, with administrative buildings, with craft specialisation and trade networks and social hierarchies that required management. At its peak, perhaps 3200 BCE, Uruk covered 6 square kilometres, held maybe 50,000 people. This was unprecedented. Nothing like it existed before. Nowhere in the world. Uruk was the template, the prototype, the place where urban living was invented, where humans learned to live in densities that required new forms of organisation, new technologies of control and coordination, new systems for managing resources and labour, and the inevitable conflicts that arise when thousands share space. And at the centre of Uruk, dominating the city, were temples, massive structures, the Eanna precinct dedicated to Inanna, the Anu ziggurat, buildings on a scale that dwarfed previous shrines, that required enormous labour, that announced through their size and elaboration that the divine realm mattered, that gods were central, that whatever these structures housed or honoured or connected to, it was important enough to command the city's resources, to organise collective effort around, to build towards sky. Perhaps you're wondering what this looked like. The scale, the ambition. Imagine a world where the largest human structure was maybe a mud brick shrine a few meters tall. And then, within a few generations, buildings rising 20 meters, 30, decorated with elaborate facades, columned halls, spaces designed to inspire awe, to make humans feel small, to create the psychological experience of encountering something greater, something that exceeds human scale and human capability. Whether gods walked in those spaces, whether they were ever physically present, the buildings certainly created space for that possibility, made it feel plausible, made the divine seem near, imminent, almost touchable. Writing emerged at the same time, not coincidentally, the same period, the same cities. The earliest written documents, around 3400 BCE, are administrative, lists of goods, rations distributed, offerings made, temple accounts. The first writing wasn't literature, wasn't mythology, was record keeping, was the bureaucratic technology required to manage complex institutions, to track resources flowing in and out, to maintain the elaborate systems that kept cities functioning. Writing enabled scale, enabled organizations too large for memory alone, enabled the institutions that would define Mesopotamian civilization. And in those earliest texts, scratched into clay tablets that survived 4,000 years, the gods appear. Not yet with elaborate mythologies, not yet with detailed stories, but as names, as recipients of offerings, as presences that receive labor and resources. An, Inanna, Enki, the major deities, and also, in lists, in the background, the Anunnaki, mentioned, acknowledged, present in the written record from the moment the written record begins. They're not described yet, not explained, just named, listed, assumed, as if everyone knows who they are, as if their existence is obvious, unquestioned, the foundation on which everything else rests. Take a breath here. Let that emergence settle. Some believers in ancient astronaut theory see this moment as crucial, as the point where gods stop being vague concepts and become specific presences because they actually arrived. Because this is when contact happened, when the Anunnaki came to Earth, or became more directly involved, or established visible presence in ways that left clear evidence. The explosion of civilization, the sudden appearance of writing and monumental architecture and urban organization. The leap from agricultural villages to complex cities in just a few centuries. This, they argue, requires explanation, requires cause, and perhaps the cause was intervention, was teaching, was beings with knowledge. Humans didn't have sharing that knowledge, showing us how to organize, how to build, how to write, the gifts of civilization from those who already possessed it. The mainstream archaeological view is different, sees continuity where ancient astronaut theorists see discontinuity, points to the Ubaid foundations, to the gradual development of irrigation and specialization and social hierarchy, to the way complexity builds on complexity. The Uruk period is dramatic, but it's not disconnected from what came before. It's acceleration. It's the moment when accumulated innovations reach critical mass and transform suddenly into something new. This happens in evolution, in technology, in social systems. The gradual becomes the rapid. The incremental becomes the revolutionary, not because of outside intervention, but because internal processes reach tipping points, because conditions align, because the stage is set and the leap becomes possible. Both interpretations fit the evidence. That's the problem, or perhaps that's the richness. The archaeological record shows dramatic change, shows the emergence of something unprecedented, but dramatic change can be explained through human agency or through intervention, through internal development or external teaching. The evidence doesn't definitively prove either interpretation, doesn't close the question, just shows that something remarkable happened, that between 4000 BCE and 3000 BCE, Mesopotamia transformed, and the gods, already present in shrines and offerings, became specific, became named, became the Anunnaki and the pantheon we recognize in later texts. Whether they walked the streets of Uruk, whether they inhabited the temples built for them, whether they spoke with priests and kings and craftsmen, that's the question we're exploring. And the Uruk period is where the question becomes answerable, where there's enough evidence to look for traces, enough writing to examine claims, enough archaeology to check whether physical presence left physical marks. The stage is no longer empty. the actors are named, the story is being recorded, and now we can ask not whether gods existed in belief, but whether they existed in fact, whether the Anunnaki were residents of Uruk alongside the humans, whether the birth of the city was also the arrival of the gods, or whether the gods were born from the city, created by humans to explain and organize and give meaning to the unprecedented transformation they were living through. Both stories begin here, in the dust and heat of southern Mesopotamia, in the cities rising from the plain, in the moment when history begins and we can finally start looking for evidence of what the ancient people claimed, of who walked among them, of whether the gods were visitors or inventions. The question is open. The investigation can begin. When archaeologists first translated the cuneiform texts, when they learned to read the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, they discovered something unexpected. Not grand philosophical treatises, not epic narratives, but lists, accounts, administrative records. The first documents humanity produced were practical, mundane even, rations distributed, offerings recorded, workers assigned, the bureaucracy of temple management. But within those lists, within the careful accounting of barley and beer and labour, the gods appeared. The tablets are small, most fit in your hand, clay rectangles impressed while soft, then dried or fired to permanence. The writing is dense, tiny wedge marks packed close together. The clay feels cool and smooth when you touch it, surprisingly delicate for something that survived millennia. The tablets sit in museum cases now, behind glass, under controlled temperature and humidity, silent witnesses to a world that dissolved back into earth while they remained, hard, permanent, preserving information their creators thought temporary, preserving the names of gods who may have walked among them. The earliest clear references to the Anunnaki appear around 2600 BCE in the early dynastic period. By then, writing had evolved, become more sophisticated, capable of expressing not just quantities but narratives, not just lists but ideas. And in those texts, the Anunnaki are mentioned, not as abstract concepts, but as specific beings, with roles, with relationships to other gods, with functions in the divine hierarchy. They're described as offspring of An, the sky god, as judges, as those who decree fate, as members of the divine council that governs cosmic order. Perhaps the most interesting thing is how casually they're mentioned, not introduced, not explained, just assumed, as if everyone knows who the Anunnaki are, as if their existence is obvious, unquestioned. The way you might mention a government office without explaining what government is. The texts assume knowledge, assume the reader shares understanding of divine structure. This suggests the concept was already old, already established, already part of the cultural framework everyone operated within. The Anunnaki weren't new in 2600 BCE. They were foundational, present in the stories and beliefs that shaped how people understood reality. But what did the Sumerians actually believe about them? What did Anunnaki mean to someone living in Ur or Uruk or Lagash? The texts are frustratingly unclear. They tell us the Anunnaki exist. They give them roles, but they don't describe appearance, don't explain origin, don't detail activities. The information is fragmentary, scattered across thousands of tablets, embedded in contexts that assume knowledge we don't have. We're reconstructing belief system from administrative notes, from scattered mythological fragments, from poetic passages in hymns and prayers, like reconstructing modern religion from tax records and parliamentary minutes. Possible, but incomplete, full of gaps we can only fill with speculation. Take a breath, let that limitation settle. Some tablets describe the Anunnaki as seven divine judges of the underworld. Others suggest 50 great gods who determine fate. The number varies, or perhaps different texts refer to different groups, different functions. The Anunnaki might not be single category, but multiple, overlapping classifications. The way government official covers many roles and levels, the texts don't clarify, don't provide organizational chart, just mention the Anunnaki in ways that suggest everyone understood distinctions we've lost, categories that made sense then but are obscure now. What's clear is hierarchy. The Anunnaki are important, but not supreme. Above them are the great gods, An-Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Utu. the major figures with major temples and major cult centers. The Anunnaki seem to be administrators, perhaps, divine bureaucrats, necessary for cosmic function but not at the top. This is interesting. If ancient astronaut theory is correct, if the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors, why weren't they supreme? Why does the hierarchy place sky gods above them? Perhaps because Anunnaki referred to specific subset, specific generation or group. Perhaps the greater gods were older, higher rank, different origin. The texts don't explain, just preserve the hierarchy without justifying it. The absence of physical description is notable. We have statues of the major gods, visual representations, art showing their attributes and symbols. But the Anunnaki, they're rarely depicted, rarely visualized. They remain textual, present in writing, but absent from art. Does this suggest they were abstract, conceptual, never physically present? Or does it suggest they were so commonly known, so regularly encountered, that depiction was unnecessary? Everyone knew what they looked like. No need to record it. Both explanations fit the silence. Both are speculation filling gaps in evidence. Perhaps most frustrating is the lack of origin story. Where did the Anunnaki come from? How did they become what they are? The texts don't say. Or if they do, we haven't found those texts. Or we have them but can't recognize them. Thousands of tablets remain untranslated, sitting in museum storage, uncatalogued, unread. The information might be there, waiting, or might never have been written, might have been oral tradition, might have been knowledge so fundamental it didn't need recording. Everyone knows where the Anunnaki came from. Why write it down? But that means we don't know, can't verify, can only work with fragments that assume knowledge we don't possess. The tablets that mention the Anunnaki most clearly date to after the society that created them was well established. By the time we have detailed texts, Sumerian civilization is mature, has existed for centuries. The gods are already integrated, already part of the system. We don't have the founding documents, don't have the moment of introduction, don't have texts saying, and then the Anunnaki arrived, or the Anunnaki have always been here, or anything that would clarify the relationship. We have mentions, references, assumptions, but not explanations, not origins, not the clarity that would resolve the question of whether they walked among humans or existed only in human imagination. The tablets speak, but they speak in language we partly understand to audience who understood completely. They preserve information, but not the information we most want, not the answers to questions we're asking 4,000 years later. They tell us the Anunnaki were real to the Sumerians, were part of their conceptual world, were beings they acknowledged and honored and included in their understanding of cosmic order. But whether real to the Sumerians means physically present or religiously believed in, that's the question the tablets don't answer, don't clarify, just leave open, leave ambiguous, leave us wondering whether we're reading about gods or about aliens, about theology or about history, about belief or about encounter. The tablets speak, but they speak in riddles, in fragments, in gaps we must somehow cross to reach understanding that may not be reachable, that may require accepting uncertainty as the only honest position, as the only answer the evidence actually supports. When the Epic of Gilgamesh was finally translated in the 1870s, when scholars could read the Akkadian text pressed into tablets found at Nineveh, they discovered something remarkable. Not just ancient literature, not just the oldest complete narrative we have, but descriptions, specific descriptions of how humans encountered gods, how divine beings appeared, what they looked like, how they acted. The epic wasn't theological text, wasn't abstract, it was story. And in that story, gods walked, spoke, interacted, behaved like persons you could meet, touch, know. The tablets describing Gilgamesh date to around 1200 BCE. But the stories are older, much older. Sumerian versions exist from 1,000 years earlier. And the stories themselves, they might describe events from 2700 BCE, when Gilgamesh might have been actual king of Uruk, when the city he supposedly ruled actually existed, when the gods he supposedly encountered supposedly walked among humans. The layers of time are dizzying, story preserved for millennia, copied and recopied, translated from Sumerian to Akkadian, refined and elaborated, becoming the version we have, the version that describes divine encounter in detail. The epic begins with Gilgamesh as tyrant, too strong, too restless, oppressing his people. The gods, hearing complaints, decide to create companion, someone to match Gilgamesh, to channel his energy, to balance him. The goddess Aruru creates Enkidu, takes clay, molds it, breathes life, and Enkidu exists, living man, wild man, born fully formed from divine action. This is creation, direct creation, physical manipulation producing physical being. The text describes it matter-of-factly, as if this is how things happen, as if gods creating humans is normal, expected, the stuff of everyday divine activity. Enkidu is interesting. He's created, but he's not quite human, not quite civilized. He lives with animals, doesn't know language, doesn't know tools or clothing or any of the markers of human culture. A woman civilizes him, teaches him, brings him into human world, and only then can he meet Gilgamesh, only then can he function in the city. The trajectory suggests something. That divine creation produces raw material. But culture, civilization, that's human addition. That's learned. That's not given by gods, but developed by humans. Perhaps that's telling. Perhaps it suggests the Sumerians understood gods didn't create civilization, just created capacity, the raw potential. Humans did the rest. Take a breath. Rest with that idea. Gilgamesh and Enkidu become friends. Brothers almost. They go on adventures together. They fight Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest. They kill the bull of heaven sent by Ishtar. And in these adventures, gods are present. Not distant, not abstract, but active participants. Ishtar propositions Gilgamesh. He refuses. She's offended. Demands her father create the bull of heaven to punish him. The gods discuss, debate, decide, take action. They're portrayed as having emotions, having desires, having personalities, having agency. They're not forces of nature. They're persons, beings, characters in the story with their own motivations and responses. When Enkidu dies, when the gods decree his death as punishment for killing Humbaba and the bull, Gilgamesh is devastated. His friend is gone, and Gilgamesh realizes he will die too. Everyone dies, even the mighty, even the semi-divine, even someone who is 2/3 god and 1/3 human, as Gilgamesh is described. Death is universal, inescapable, and Gilgamesh cannot accept this, so he goes seeking the one human who escaped death, seeking Utnapishtim, the flood survivor granted immortality by the gods. The journey to Utnapishtim is long, difficult. Gilgamesh crosses mountains, passes through darkness, reaches the waters at the edge of the world, and there, living on distant shore, he finds Utnapishtim, a man, actual man, who was mortal but became immortal, who survived the flood, who was granted eternal life as reward. And Gilgamesh asks, How did you achieve this? How can I escape death as you did? Utnapishtim tells the flood story, tells how the gods decided to destroy humanity, how Ea warned him, how he built a boat, how he survived, how the gods, regretting their decision, granted him and his wife immortality, transported them to edge of the world, made them like gods. The story is detailed, specific, physical. The boat is measured, the duration is given, the landing place is named. This is not abstract mythology. This is narrative presented as if it happened, as if these events occurred, as if gods were present, acting, making decisions, transporting humans, granting gifts. But then Utnapishtim explains, this was unique, one-time event. The gods won't do it again, won't grant immortality, won't flood the world. Gilgamesh cannot achieve what Utnapishtim achieved because the conditions that allowed it no longer exist. The gods made exception once, won't make it twice. Gilgamesh is defeated, returns home, accepts mortality. The story ends with acceptance, with recognition that death is natural, that seeking to escape it is futile, that human life, however limited, is still valuable, still worth living. What does this tell us about Sumerian understanding of gods? The epic portrays them as physical, as beings who can create humans from clay, who can appear, speak, give commands, grant gifts, who have personalities and emotions and relationships with each other and with humans. The text treats divine encounter as possible, normal, the stuff of heroes' lives. Gilgamesh interacts with gods, so did Utnapishtim, so did Enkidu, who was created by them. Divine human interaction is, the narrative suggests, real, actual, something that happens. But is this evidence? Is literary portrayal the same as historical claim? Does describing gods as physical mean the Sumerians encountered physical gods? Or does it mean their theology imagined gods in physical terms? We tell stories about God or gods acting in history, creating, intervening, speaking. Does that mean we believe these stories are literally physically true, or that we use physical language to describe spiritual realities? The epic doesn't clarify, presents gods as actors, as characters, as beings who appear and speak and affect the world. But whether this reflects actual belief in physical presence, or whether it's literary convention, or whether it's theology expressed through narrative, the text doesn't say, can't say, just presents the story, lets us interpret, lets us decide whether we're reading history or mythology, whether Gilgamesh met gods, or whether later storytellers described him meeting gods to make theological points. Whether the Anunnaki walked among humans, or whether humans imagined they did and wrote stories that preserve that imagination. The question remains. The epic is evidence, but evidence of what? Of encounter, or of belief in encounter? Of gods who walked, or of humans who told stories about gods walking? The ambiguity is irreducible. The text gives us both possibilities, supports both interpretations, and perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps uncertainty is the honest position. Perhaps admitting we can't know, based on literary evidence alone, whether gods were physically present. Perhaps that's more accurate than claiming certainty either way. The epic speaks, but like the tablets, it speaks in ways that allow multiple readings, multiple understandings, multiple answers to the question of whether the Anunnaki really walked among early humans in Sumer. Let me tell you about a discovery, about a moment when the earth revealed its secrets, about archaeologists standing in southern Iraq, brushing away millennia, uncovering something that had been buried for 5,000 years. This happened in the 1940s and 1950s. The excavation of Eridu, the site the Sumerians themselves called the first city, the place where, according to their own traditions, kingship first descended from heaven, where civilization began, where the gods first established presence on earth. The tell at Eridu rises from the desert, a mound of broken brick and accumulated debris, not dramatic, not obviously significant, just higher than the surrounding plain, the kind of feature that marks ancient settlement throughout Mesopotamia. Beneath the surface, the archaeologists knew, lay the remains of temples, shrines to Enki, the god of fresh water, the god of wisdom, the god who, in later texts, would be credited with creating humanity, with teaching crafts, with giving knowledge. Enki was important, and Eridu was his city, his primary cult center, the place most associated with his presence. The team, led by Fuad Safar and Seaton Lloyd, began digging, carefully, patiently, the way archaeology is done, not treasure hunting, not dramatic discovery, just slow revelation, layer by layer, brush stroke by brush stroke, exposing what had been hidden, what had been waiting in darkness for 5 millennia. What would tell them, if anything could, about the earliest religion, the earliest gods, the earliest human understanding of divine presence? What they found was extraordinary. Not one temple, but many, layer upon layer, 18 distinct building levels, each one a temple, each one built directly atop the ruins of the previous temple. Generation after generation, century after century, the people of Eridu maintained the sacred space. When a temple deteriorated, they didn't abandon it. They filled it with clean sand, leveled it, built new temple on top, keeping the location constant, keeping the sacred geometry intact, keeping the connection, whatever connection the temple represented, active, maintained, honored. The earliest temple, at the bottom, dated to around 5000 BCE, the Ubaid period, before writing, before cities, before Sumerian civilization as we know it. This temple was small, simple, A single room, perhaps 3 meters by 4 meters, mud brick walls, a platform, an altar perhaps. At one end, evidence of offerings, fish bones, the remains of marsh creatures brought as gifts, as sacrifice, as acknowledgement of whatever presence the shrine housed or honored or connected to. Take a breath here. Let that continuity settle. Above that earliest shrine, another temple, slightly larger, same footprint, same orientation, same function. And above that, another and another. Each generation building bigger, more elaborate, more decorated, but always on the same spot, always maintaining the sacred center. By the time we reach the latest layers, around 2000 BCE, the temple is massive, a ziggurat, a stepped pyramid reaching toward sky, visible for kilometers, dominating the landscape. But beneath it, in the foundations, in the deepest layers, that small Ubaid shrine, that original room where someone 5,000 years ago decided this place was sacred, where divine presence was first acknowledged, first honored, first given permanent architectural form. The fish bones are interesting, abundant, found throughout the temple sequence, offerings to Enki, the water god, the god of the Apsu, the underground freshwater ocean Mesopotamians believed existed beneath the earth. The fish make sense as offerings, marsh creatures, products of the watery realm Enki governed, but they're also practical, real, physical offerings, not just symbolic gestures. Someone caught these fish, brought them to the temple, presented them, left them as gift, as payment perhaps, as acknowledgement of relationship with the divine being who, they believed, controlled the waters they depended on. Did Enki walk among them? Did he physically appear in his temple? Did priests see him, speak with him, receive instructions from him? The architecture suggests something. The temples are real. The offerings are real. The commitment spanning millennia is real. But does material evidence of devotion prove the object of devotion was physically present? Christians build cathedrals. Muslims build mosques. Hindus build temples. The buildings are real. The offerings are real. The devotion is real. But does that prove God or gods physically inhabit the spaces? Or does it prove humans believe they do, or might, or symbolically do? The excavators found no bodies, no remains of non-human beings, no artifacts that couldn't be explained by human manufacture, no technology beyond what Bronze Age culture could produce. The temples are impressive, the continuity is remarkable, but the evidence is human, entirely human. Human-built structures, human-made offerings, human devotion. If gods walked in these spaces, if Enki appeared to his priests, if the Anunnaki were physically present, they left no physical trace, no bones, no tools, no residue, just the temples humans built for them, the offerings humans made, the texts humans wrote describing them. Perhaps absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Perhaps gods, if they existed, wouldn't leave physical remains, wouldn't need tools, wouldn't leave traces archaeology could find. Perhaps divine presence is inherently undetectable by physical investigation. Perhaps demanding physical evidence of gods is category error, like demanding physical evidence of love or justice or beauty. Some things are real without being material, without leaving archaeological traces, without being verifiable through excavation. Or perhaps the absence is telling. Perhaps if beings walked among humans for centuries, if they inhabited temples, if they received offerings and spoke with priests and involved themselves in human affairs, they would leave traces, would leave something, would affect the material record in ways we could detect. The silence might be answer, might be the evidence that most matters, not proof of non-existence, but absence of proof of existence, which, for physical claims, for assertions about beings walking and talking and being present, might be sufficient, might be reason to doubt, to question, to suspect the Anunnaki existed in belief, but not in fact. In theology, but not in history. In human imagination, but not in physical reality. The temples at Eridu still stand, partially. The ziggurat is ruins now, eroded, collapsed, but visible, present. The earliest levels are buried again, protected from weather, from looting, from the wear of exposure, but they exist, waiting, holding their secrets, holding the question of what they represent, whether they're evidence of encounter or evidence of devotion. Whether Enki's temple housed Enki or housed belief in Enki, Whether the Anunnaki walked through those spaces or whether humans built the spaces hoping the Anunnaki would walk through them, the Earth holds both possibilities, supports both interpretations, resolves nothing, just preserves the question in brick and bone and 5,000 years of human commitment to maintaining connection with something they believed or knew or hoped was real. The answer, if there is answer, waits in that space between belief and fact, between devotion and presence, between the temples humans built and the question of whether anyone divine ever inhabited them. When you imagine Sumerian life, imagine heat, always heat, the sun beating down on mud brick walls, the dust that never quite settles, the shade that everyone seeks during midday hours. This is southern Mesopotamia. This is the land between the rivers where temperatures climb to 40 degrees Celsius in summer, where the air shimmers, where work happens in early morning and late evening and the middle of the day is for resting, for waiting, for enduring until the worst of the heat passes. The cities are dense, narrow streets winding between buildings, houses sharing walls, neighborhoods clustered around temples or near markets. The wealthy have larger homes, courtyards, second floors, rooms arranged around central open space where cooking happens and children play and the family gathers when day cools. The poor live in single rooms or subdivided spaces, packed tight, sharing walls with neighbors, hearing everything, smelling everything, living in constant proximity to others. Privacy is luxury only the rich enjoy. Water defines everything. The wells, the canals, the rivers. Access to clean water determines where people can live, determines property value, determines social standing. Water carriers move through streets, bringing water from canals to households. It's labour, constant labour, filling jars, hauling weight, distributing the resource that makes life possible in a place that would otherwise be uninhabitable. The irrigation systems are sophisticated, channels and gates and controlled flooding, but maintaining them requires organisation, requires cooperation, requires the collective effort that city life demands. Imagine walking through around 2500 BCE, the city at its height, 50,000 people perhaps. The ziggurat dominates, rises above everything else, visible from kilometres away, announcing the city's presence, announcing its wealth, its devotion, its connection to the divine realm. Around the ziggurat, the temple complex, workshops, storerooms, administrative buildings. The temple isn't just religious institution, it's economic centre, largest employer, largest landowner, the institution that organises much of the city's labour and resources. Beyond the temple, the residential quarters, the houses of merchants and artisans and scribes, the neighbourhoods where craftsmen work, potters, weavers, metalworkers, carpenters. Each craft has its district, its area, its community of practitioners who share knowledge and compete for clients and train the next generation. The work is skilled, specialised. The products, pottery, textiles, tools, jewellery, these are traded, moved along networks that extend beyond the city, beyond Sumer, to Anatolia and the Levant and the Gulf. Sumerian goods travel far, bring wealth back, create prosperity that shows in the temples and palaces and elaborate burial goods archaeologists find. Take a breath, rest in this world. The markets bustle, stalls selling grain and fish and dates, vegetables from gardens, meat from herds, beer, always beer. The Sumerians drink more beer than water, safer, more nutritious. Barley beer, drunk through straws to filter out the grain, drunk at work, at home, at festivals. Beer is currency sometimes, payment for labour, rations distributed, beer and bread, the staples that keep the city fed, that keep the workers working, that make urban life possible. Temples receive offerings constantly, not just fish, but grain, animals, textiles, labour. The gods must be fed, must be clothed, must be served. The daily routine of temple service is elaborate. Morning offerings, noon offerings, evening offerings. The statue of the god, housed in the inner sanctuary, receives meals, literal meals, food placed before the statue, left for the god to consume, spiritually, then redistributed, given to priests, to temple workers. The offerings support the temple economy, support the people who maintain the cult, who perform the rituals, who keep the connection. Whatever connection exists or is believed to exist between human and divine realms active, maintained. But where are the gods in this? Where are the Anunnaki? The daily life of Sumerian cities is thoroughly human. Human labor, human organization, human commerce and craft and social hierarchy. The gods are present, in belief, in ritual, in the structures built for them. But physically, the temples are staffed by human priests. The offerings are made by human hands. The decisions about temple administration are made by human officials. If gods walk among humans, if the Anunnaki are physically present, they are remarkably invisible in the daily functioning of the city, remarkably absent from the practical operations that keep civilization running. Perhaps that's intentional. Perhaps gods, if present, don't involve themselves in mundane matters, don't participate in daily commerce, don't appear except at crucial moments, at coronations, at major festivals, at times of crisis. Perhaps divine presence is rare, special, not constant companionship, but occasional intervention. The Sumerians might have believed gods walked among them, but not frequently, not visibly, not in ways that would make them obvious to casual observation. The gods were there. The belief went, but hidden, withdrawn, accessible only to priests in inner sanctuaries, to kings in private audiences, to the chosen few who could approach divine presence and survive the encounter. Or perhaps the gods were always metaphorical, always theological concepts rather than physical beings. The Sumerians built temples and made offerings and wrote texts describing divine actions because this is how religion works, how humans relate to powers beyond their control, how we organize our understanding of existence and meaning and the forces that shape our lives. The absence of gods from daily life doesn't prove they didn't exist, but it doesn't prove they did either. Just shows that Sumerian civilization, for all its god talk, for all its temple building, for all its elaborate theology, functioned through human effort, through human intelligence, through human organization and cooperation and the slow accumulation of practical knowledge about irrigation and agriculture and urban management. The daily life was human, thoroughly human, impressively human. The achievement of Sumerian civilization, the cities, the writing, the art, the literature, the mathematics, the astronomy, all of it emerges from human capability, from human innovation, from the collective intelligence of thousands of people working together, sharing knowledge, building on what came before, creating something unprecedented through effort and imagination. Whether gods guided this, whether the Anunnaki taught writing and mathematics and irrigation, that remains unclear. But whether they did or not, humans made it work, humans maintained it, humans lived it daily, and that, perhaps, is what matters most. Not whether we had help, but that we built something remarkable, something that still speaks to us, still teaches us, still shows us what humans can achieve when conditions align and collective effort is organized toward creation rather than destruction. The daily life of Sumer, human, practical, impressive, and perhaps, beneath it all, touched by divine presence, or perhaps not. The ambiguity remains, as it always does, as perhaps it always must. When scholars first translated the Sumerian king list, when they could read the names and numbers pressed into clay, they found something strange, something impossible. Kings who reigned for thousands of years, tens of thousands, reigned so long they couldn't be historical, couldn't be real. The document begins, after the kingship descended from heaven. The kingship was in Eridu, and then it lists the kings and their reigns, and the numbers are extraordinary. Alulim, first king, reigned 28,800 years. Alangar, second king, 36,000 years. The list continues. 8 kings total before the flood. Their combined reigns total 241,200 years. 241,000 years. This is impossible. Humans don't live that long, don't reign that long. The numbers are mythological, symbolic, or perhaps some ancient astronaut theorists suggest accurate. Perhaps these weren't human kings. Perhaps these were Anunnaki, or Anunnaki human hybrids. Beings with lifespans far exceeding normal human limits. Beings who could reign for millennia because they didn't age as we do, didn't die as we do, The mainstream interpretation is different, more conservative, more grounded in how we understand ancient texts. The numbers are symbolic, represent prestige, antiquity, cosmic time rather than historical time. The greater the reign, the more legitimate the king, the more connected to divine order. The Predilluvian kings aren't historical figures. They're mythological, legendary, the equivalent of once upon a time, the way Genesis lists patriarchs who lived hundreds of years, not because they did, but because the numbers convey meaning beyond literal duration, convey importance, convey connection to origins, to the time when divine and human were closer, when the world was different, when the rules hadn't settled into their current forms after the flood. The king list continues, but the reigns change, become shorter, still impossibly long by normal standards, but moving toward plausibility, thousands of years, hundreds of years. And then, as the list approaches historical periods, the reigns become realistic, 30 years, 20 years, numbers we can verify against other records, numbers that match human lifespan. The transition is gradual, from mythological time to historical time, from cosmic duration to human duration, as if the document itself is moving from legend to history, from what was believed about deep past to what was known about recent past. Perhaps this transition reveals something. Perhaps it shows the Sumerians understood the difference between mythological past and historical past, between the time of origins, when things were different, when gods walked and kings lived forever, and the time of memory, when things were as they are now, when kings were human and reigns were brief and power was temporary. The king list might be preserving both, giving mythological time its due, then transitioning to historical record. The document serves multiple functions, establishes legitimacy through connection to origins, preserves actual history of later dynasties, bridges mythological and historical, does what many ancient texts do, combines categories we separate. Take a breath, let that complexity settle. But the ancient astronaut interpretation persists, points to the numbers, to the specificity. 28,800 years. Not 30,000, not a long time, but specific number, as if counted, as if recorded, as if someone knew, and perhaps that someone was the Anunnaki themselves. Perhaps they kept records, tracked their reigns, their time on Earth, and humans, scribes, preserved those numbers without understanding them, without realizing they described lifespans impossible for humans, but normal for beings from elsewhere, for beings with different biology, different relationship to time, different aging processes. The problem with this interpretation is everything else. The archaeological record shows continuity, shows human development, shows gradual progress, shows no evidence of super long-lived rulers, no tombs that suggest millennia-long reigns, no cities that show continuous occupation under single authority for thousands of years. The material evidence doesn't support the numbers, doesn't validate the reigns, doesn't show what we'd expect if kings really ruled for 28,800 years. The texts say one thing, the archaeology says another, and when texts and archaeology contradict, archaeology usually wins, because archaeology is physical, direct, less susceptible to mythological elaboration or symbolic meaning or the ways stories change in transmission. The king list also says, kingship descended from heaven. This is metaphor, most scholars agree. Means divine legitimacy, means rulership is sacred, means authority comes from gods. Standard ancient Near Eastern theology. The king rules because the gods choose him, grant him authority, support his reign. This is ideology, justification, the way power explains itself, but ancient astronaut theory reads it literally. Kingship descended from heaven because rulers came from sky, came in craft, came from Nibiru, or wherever the Anunnaki originated. The metaphor becomes history. The theological language becomes technological description. Spacecraft become divine descent. And suddenly the text means something radically different, something that requires aliens, not gods. That requires physical arrival, not symbolic legitimation. Which reading is correct? The texts don't decide. They accommodate both. They're written in language that can be read metaphorically or literally. That can mean divine legitimacy or alien arrival. that can describe mythology or history or something that blends both. The ambiguity is built in, maybe deliberately. Maybe ancient scribes knew they were preserving something that exceeded simple categories. Something that was both true and not true simultaneously, both historical and mythological, both divine and human, both memory and elaboration. The king list holds all possibilities, supports multiple interpretations, resolves nothing. What we know is this. The Sumerians believed their civilization was old, ancient, connected to origins. They preserved that belief in texts like the king list. They gave it structure, numbers, names, details. Whether those details correspond to historical reality, whether kings really reigned for thousands of years, whether the pre-Diluvian rulers were Anunnaki or mythological constructs, the text doesn't clarify, can't clarify, just preserves the Sumerian understanding that once, long ago, before the flood, things were different. Kings were different. The relationship between divine and human was different. Whether that difference was extraterrestrial presence or theological imagination, the question remains, as it has for 4,000 years, as it likely will for 4,000 more. The numbers speak, but they speak in ambiguity, in mystery, in the space between impossible and symbolic, where ancient texts so often dwell, where truth and meaning don't always align, where what was believed and what happened might be two different things, or the same thing described differently, or something we can't quite grasp because we're too far removed, too culturally distant, too committed to categories, historical or mythological, that the ancients didn't share. The king list waits, holds its secrets, offers its numbers, and leaves us wondering, as it was perhaps always meant to do. Let me tell you about a morning, a specific morning in around 2400 BCE. The city is quiet before dawn. The heat hasn't started building yet. The air is almost cool, almost pleasant. This is the best time. The time when work begins, when the day feels possible, before the sun rises high and everything becomes endurance. In the temple complex, the Kishnugul, the house of the great light, priests are already moving. They've been awake for an hour, performing ablutions, purifying themselves, washing, dressing in clean linen, preparing to enter the inner sanctuary, to approach the statue of Nana, the moon god, Ur's patron deity, the god whose temple dominates the city, whose ziggurat rises above everything, whose presence, real or believed or symbolically maintained, defines what is, what it means, why it matters. The high priest, we'll call him Nama, though that's probably not his name, leads the procession. He's old, maybe 50, ancient by Sumerian standards. He served Nana since childhood, trained in the rituals, learned the hymns, mastered the elaborate protocols that govern temple service. He knows every gesture, every word, every moment of the daily routine that keeps the god fed, content, present, whether Nana is actually present, whether the statue houses divine consciousness, whether the god literally consumes the offerings. Nama doesn't question. This is his faith, his work, his identity. He is intermediary between Nana and the city, between divine realm and human realm. This is what he does, what he was trained to do, what he'll do until death. The doors to the inner sanctuary are sealed, have been sealed since yesterday evening, since the final offerings were made and the god was left to rest. Now, with dawn approaching, the seals are broken, the doors swing open, heavy cedar doors, imported from Lebanon, expensive, fragrant. The scent of cedar mixes with the incense burning in bronze holders. The smoke rises, thick, sweet, filling the chamber with haze that makes everything dreamlike, mysterious, set apart from ordinary world. The statue sits on a raised platform, life-sized, made of precious materials. The core is wood, but covered in gold leaf, inlaid with lapis lazuli and carnelian. The eyes are large, staring, made of shell and obsidian. They catch the lamplight, seem to watch, seem aware. The effect is intentional. The statue is meant to be alive, to house the god's presence, to be more than representation, to be, in some sense, Nana himself, or the place where Nana chooses to dwell. to manifest, to make himself available to human worship. Take a breath, feel that presence. Urnama approaches, slowly, with prescribed gestures, bowing at specific points, murmuring prayers. The junior priests follow, carrying trays, bread, beer, dates, roasted meat, the morning meal, the first offerings of the day. The food is elaborate, prepared according to exact specifications. The bread must be a certain shape, the beer a certain strength, the dates from specific groves. Every detail matters, every element carries meaning. This is not casual feeding, this is ritual, sacred service, the maintenance of relationship between God and city. The offerings are placed before the statue, arranged carefully. Urnama speaks the formal words, the invocations. Nana, great Lord, King of the gods, Lord of accept these offerings from your servant. The formulas are ancient, have been spoken every morning for centuries, for as long as the temple has stood. Longer, perhaps. The words themselves carry power. Connect this moment to every previous moment. Link this offering to all previous offerings. Create continuity, tradition, the eternal present of ritual time. The statue doesn't respond, doesn't move, doesn't speak. But Urnama isn't expecting it to, not directly. The god's response comes differently, in omens, in dreams, in the well-being of the city. If prospers, if the harvests are good, if wars are won, then Nana is pleased, is accepting the offerings, is dwelling in the temple, is protecting his city. The feedback is indirect, interpretive, requires faith to recognize. But to Urnama, it's real, it works. The system functions. Has thrived for generations. The temple is wealthy. The god is served. Whatever the mechanism, whatever the actual relationship between ritual and prosperity, it works. And that's what matters. After the offerings are placed, the priests withdraw. Leave the god to consume them, spiritually. The food remains physically, but the essence, the spiritual substance, that's what the god takes, what he needs, what sustains him. Later, the physical food will be removed, redistributed, given to priests and temple workers as payment, as rations. The god's leftovers support those who serve him. This is practical, economical. The temple system converts offerings into support for religious infrastructure, converts devotion into employment, into livelihood for hundreds who maintain the cult. Urnama exits the sanctuary. The doors are sealed again, won't open until noon offerings. The morning ritual is complete. He moves to his administrative duties. The temple is economic institution, landowner, employer, manager of resources. Urnama isn't just priest. He's administrator, oversees accounts, makes decisions about temple property, about loans the temple makes, about construction projects, about diplomatic relations with other cities' temples. The religious and economic are inseparable. The sacred and practical merge. This is how temples function, how they maintain themselves, how they become central to civilization's operations. But one question lingers. During that ritual, during the placing of offerings, during the prayers and invocations, was Nana actually present? Was the god in the statue? Was he watching through those shell and obsidian eyes? Was he aware of Urnama's service, of the city's devotion? Or was the statue just statue, wood and gold and precious stones arranged to look divine but housing nothing, creating psychological space for belief but not containing actual presence? Urnama would say yes, of course Nana is present. The ritual works, the system functions, the god protects How could that happen if he isn't real, if he isn't there? The evidence is the city's prosperity, is the successful completion of the ritual, is the felt sense of divine presence that Urnama experiences when he enters the sanctuary, is the dreams that guide him, the omens that speak, the way prayers are answered, sometimes, in ways that confirm faith, that validate the practice, that make the service meaningful. A skeptic might say no, the statue is object, beautiful object, impressive object, but object nonetheless. The ritual is performance, meaningful to participants, psychologically powerful, socially important, but not involving actual deity, not hosting divine presence. Just humans doing what humans do, creating meaning through ritual, through commitment, through shared practice that binds community and defines identity. The offerings aren't consumed by Nana, they're redistributed by priests. The prayers aren't heard by God, they're spoken by humans to other humans through symbolic medium that everyone agrees to treat as if it's real, which is true. Was Nana in the temple that morning? Was he present during Ornama's service? Did he accept the offerings? Did he watch through the statue's eyes? Or was the entire ritual, however meaningful, human activity directed at human creation? The question applies to all gods, to all temples, to all rituals throughout history, and it applies especially to the Anunnaki. If they walked among humans, if they were present in their temples, if priests served them directly, where's the evidence beyond ritual, beyond belief, beyond the human practice of treating statues as if they house gods and temples as if they're divine dwellings? The morning in continues. The sun rises, the heat builds, the city wakes, and in the temple, Nana's statue sits in darkness, silent, still, waiting for noon offerings, for evening prayers, for the perpetual cycle of service that has continued for centuries and will continue for centuries more, until falls, until the temples are abandoned, until the rituals cease and the gods, wherever they are, wherever they ever were, no longer receive the devotion that sustained them, or sustained belief in them, or sustained the system that made civilization possible whether gods were real or not. The ambiguity persists, as it always has, as perhaps it must. The morning ritual is complete, the god is served. Whether the god is there, that remains the question, the eternal question, the one the evidence never quite answers. The one faith fills in one direction and skepticism fills in another. And the truth, whatever it is, waits in the space between. In the sanctuary, no human fully understands. In the silence that might be absence or might be presence too profound for our recognition, when you hold a cylinder seal, when you feel its weight in your palm, you're touching something intimate, something personal. These were not public monuments, not temple architecture, not royal inscriptions. These were possessions, carried by individuals, used to mark property, to sign documents, to identify ownership. Small stone cylinders, maybe 3 centimeters tall, carved with intricate scenes. When rolled across wet clay, they left impressions, images, stories, proof of identity, proof of transaction, proof of authority, and in those images, gods appear. The seals are beautiful, carved from hard stone, lapis lazuli, carnelian, hematite, serpentine. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The detail is minute, microscopic almost. Scenes packed with figures, with symbols, with narrative compressed into space smaller than your palm. The seal cutters were artists, masters. Their work survives when so much else has disappeared. The seals endure. Hard stone doesn't decay, doesn't dissolve, outlasts the clay it impressed, outlasts the buildings that housed it, outlasts almost everything except, perhaps, the questions it raises. The scenes show gods, or beings identified as gods. They're larger than humans in the images, more prominent, more detailed. They wear horned crowns, the symbol of divinity in Mesopotamian art. They hold symbols of power, weapons, tools, standards. They're depicted in action, blessing kings, receiving worshippers, fighting demons, participating in cosmic battles. The visual language is clear. These are divine beings, superior beings, beings with authority and power and roles in maintaining cosmic order. But what do the images actually show? Are they portraits? Depictions of how gods actually appeared, or are they symbolic representations, visual shorthand for theological concepts? When the seal cutter carved a god with horned crown and flowing robes, was he carving from memory of actual appearance, or was he following artistic convention, using established iconography to represent divine status regardless of whether gods looked like this? The images are evidence, but evidence of what? Of encounter or of imagination? Perhaps the most famous seal, the most controversial, is VA243, held in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. It dates to around 2500 BCE, shows typical Sumerian scene, enthroned figure, attendants, symbols, but in the upper left corner, a cluster of dots, circular arrangement, and this, ancient astronaut theorists say, is solar system diagram, central sun, planets orbiting, and crucially, more planets than ancients should have known. They count 11 or 12 bodies, including outer planets invisible to naked eye, including, perhaps, Nibiru. The evidence, they claim, that Sumerians had astronomical knowledge they couldn't have acquired without help, without teaching, without extraterrestrial intervention. Take a breath. Let that claim settle. The mainstream interpretation is different, more cautious, more grounded in understanding ancient Near Eastern iconography. The dots might be stars, might be divine symbols, might be decorative elements. The arrangement might be artistic choice rather than astronomical diagram. Reading modern astronomical understanding into 4,500-year-old image, this is projection, is seeing what we want to see, is interpreting ambiguous image through framework the original artist didn't share. The seal shows something, but whether that something is solar system, that's speculation, interpretation, not verified by any text, not confirmed by any other seal showing similar pattern, not supported by Mesopotamian astronomical texts, which are extensive and which never mention outer planets beyond Saturn. Other seals show gods descending, coming from above, appearing to humans. Some show winged figures. Some show beings emerging from doorways or gates that suggest passage between realms, between heaven and earth, between divine space and human space. These images are striking, suggestive. They show movement, show arrival, show gods who come from elsewhere, from above, from outside normal human space. The visual language implies something, implies beings who don't permanently reside in human realm but visit, who cross boundaries, who appear and disappear. But again, interpretation is everything. Descent from heaven is standard theological imagery. Gods dwell in heaven, come to earth when needed, return to heaven afterward. This is how ancient Near Eastern religion works. The gods' primary residence is sky. Their temples on earth are secondary residences, perhaps, places they visit, places they maintain presence through statues and rituals. But their true home is above, is celestial, is beyond. The imagery of descent doesn't require spacecraft, doesn't require physical travel, just requires belief that divine realm is up, is sky, is heaven, and human realm is down, is earth, is here. The movement between them can be metaphorical, spiritual, theological, doesn't have to be physical, doesn't have to be aliens in craft, can be gods doing what gods do in religious imagination, crossing boundaries between realms, making themselves accessible to human devotion. The winged figures are interesting. Some show gods with wings, some show hybrid creatures, lion-bodied beings with human heads, bird-headed figures, combinations that don't exist in nature. These are clearly symbolic, clearly artistic imagination, clearly not attempts at realistic portrayal. The wings might represent flight, or might represent speed, or might represent divine nature, or might just be artistic convention, visual marker that this being is special, different, more than human. The wings don't prove the gods flew, don't prove they came from space, don't prove anything except that Mesopotamian artists used wings to mark divine or supernatural status. Perhaps what's most telling is consistency. The seals show gods, but they show gods who look mostly human, taller perhaps, more elaborately dressed, with symbols of power, but human in basic form, bipedal, faced, proportioned like humans. If the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial, if they came from other worlds, why would they look so human? Why would they share our basic body plan? Convergent evolution is possible, but unlikely to produce beings so similar we'd need only horned crown to distinguish them. The similarity suggests, perhaps, that the images were created by humans imagining enhanced humans, idealized humans, powerful humans, not aliens, not beings from elsewhere, but gods imagined in our image because we can't imagine too far beyond what we know. The cylinder seals are evidence, rich evidence, but ambiguous evidence. They show that Sumerians imagined their gods in specific ways, gave them visual form, depicted them in scenes of power and blessing and cosmic maintenance. But whether those depictions reflect actual appearance, actual encounter, actual memory of beings who walked among them, that's what we can't determine, can't verify. The images accommodate both interpretations, support both possibilities, resolve nothing except that gods mattered, were important enough to depict, were central enough to artistic production that thousands of seals show them, were real enough, in some sense, to be worth representing. Whether that reality was physical or spiritual, material or imagined, the seals don't say, can't say. Just show us what ancient Mesopotamians believed was important, what they carried with them, what they used to mark their place in world that included gods. Whether those gods ever marked their own place, whether they left evidence beyond human depiction, that remains hidden. Remains the question that visual evidence raises but never quite answers. Beneath the clay tablets, hidden in the mathematical texts, lies knowledge that still impresses modern astronomers. The Mesopotamians watched the sky with patience we can barely imagine. Night after night, year after year, generation after generation, recording what they saw, tracking patterns, calculating cycles, building understanding of celestial mechanics that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 3,000 years. The question is, how did they learn it? Through centuries of observation? Or through teaching from those who already knew? The astronomical tablets are remarkable, precise, sophisticated. They track Venus with extraordinary accuracy, record its appearances and disappearances, its cycles, its relationship to Earth and Sun. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, dating to around 1600 BCE but recording observations much older, lists the rising and setting of Venus over 21 years. The precision is stunning, the understanding is profound. Venus doesn't move randomly, follows patterns, repeats cycles, and the Mesopotamians knew those patterns, could predict them, could use them for calendar, for omens, for organizing time itself. They knew the planets, all 5 visible to naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They distinguished them from stars, knew they moved differently, followed their own paths through the fixed constellations. The word planet comes from Greek, means wanderer. But the Mesopotamians understood the concept millennia earlier, called them wild sheep in some texts, wandering among the fixed stars like sheep among a flock. The metaphor is charming, but the knowledge behind it is serious, is based on centuries of careful observation, of noting positions, of tracking movements, of building understanding through patient accumulation of data. The lunar calculations are perhaps most impressive. The moon's cycle is complex, not quite 30 days, not quite regular because Earth's orbit is elliptical. The moon speeds and slows. But the Mesopotamians could predict eclipses, could calculate when moon would darken, when shadow would cross its face. This requires understanding not just moon's motion, but Earth's shadow, sun's position, the geometry of 3 bodies in space. The mathematics is sophisticated. The predictions are accurate, sometimes within hours, sometimes within minutes. This is not primitive astronomy. This is science, real science, based on observation and mathematics and models that reflect reality with remarkable precision. Perhaps most intriguing is the zodiac, the division of sky into 12 sections, 12 constellations the sun passes through during the year. This is Mesopotamian innovation, their creation. They identified the constellations, named them, assigned them meanings. The zodiac we use today, Aries through Pisces, is their zodiac, slightly modified by Greeks, but essentially Mesopotamian. This shows systematic thinking, shows organizing principle, shows attempt to structure chaos, to make sky comprehensible, predictable, useful for tracking time and seasons and agricultural cycles. Take a breath here. Let that knowledge settle. But did they know more? Ancient astronaut theory claims yes, claims the Mesopotamians knew about outer planets, about Uranus and Neptune and Pluto, about celestial bodies invisible to naked eye, about solar system structure that shouldn't be knowable without telescopes. The evidence cited is ambiguous. Some texts mention astronomical numbers. Some lists count celestial bodies. But interpreting those texts is difficult. The language is technical. The context is often unclear. The numbers might mean what ancient astronaut theorists say they mean, or might mean something entirely different, something we don't understand because we lack the full framework the ancient astronomers operated within. The mainstream view is simpler, more conservative. The Mesopotamians knew what naked eye observation allows: 5 planets, moon, sun, stars. They watched patiently, recorded carefully, calculated brilliantly, but they didn't know about outer planets, didn't know about Uranus discovered in 1781, didn't know about Neptune discovered in 1846, didn't know about Pluto discovered in 1930. These bodies are too faint, too distant, require optical instruments the Mesopotamians didn't have. The silence in the texts about outer planets isn't mysterious, is expected, is what we'd find if observation was naked eye only, if knowledge came through human effort alone without extraterrestrial teaching. So where does the astronomical knowledge come from? The ancient astronaut answer is teaching. The Anunnaki brought it, shared it, showed humans how to observe, what to look for, how to calculate. The knowledge appeared suddenly, they claim, without evident developmental period. Therefore, it was gifted, given by those who already possessed it, by beings from civilization with telescopes or advanced observation techniques, or simply longer history of sky watching. The gift of astronomy from the sky gods makes sense. If gods came from sky, if they travelled through space, if they wanted humans to understand cosmic context, to know we're part of something larger, to see Earth as planet among planets. The mainstream answer is observation, patience, time. The Mesopotamians had all three. They lived in region with clear skies, limited light pollution, ideal conditions for naked eye astronomy. They had institutional support, temples funded observation, employed specialists, maintained continuity of knowledge across generations. They had cultural motivation. The sky affected agriculture, religious calendar, political omens. Understanding sky was practical, necessary, worth investing resources in. Over centuries, over millennia, the knowledge accumulated. Each generation added to what came before, refined models, improved predictions, built sophistication through sustained collective effort. No teaching required, just human intelligence applied persistently to solvable problem. Both explanations fit, both account for the sophistication, both explain why Mesopotamian astronomy was so advanced, but they differ on mechanism, on whether humans did it alone or had help, and the evidence, remarkable as it is, doesn't decide. Shows sophistication, but not how sophistication was achieved. Shows knowledge, but not how knowledge was acquired. The tablets record observations, record calculations, but don't record lessons, don't describe teachers, don't mention Anunnaki showing priests how to track Venus or predict eclipses or understand zodiac. The astronomical texts are just astronomical texts. Data and mathematics, no pedagogical narrative, no origin story, just the knowledge itself, preserved, transmitted, used. Perhaps what's hidden isn't technology, isn't secret teaching, but something simpler, the human capacity for systematic observation, for pattern recognition, for mathematical thinking, for building models that predict future based on past. The Mesopotamians had these capacities, used them brilliantly, created astronomy through collective effort over centuries. The knowledge isn't mysterious if you assume humans can learn, can observe, can think, can accumulate understanding through time. The mystery only exists if you assume we couldn't have done it alone. That knowledge, this sophisticated, requires teaching, requires intervention, requires gods or aliens or someone showing us what we supposedly couldn't discover ourselves. But perhaps we could. Perhaps we did. Perhaps the hidden dimension isn't extraterrestrial assistance but human capability, human persistence, human intelligence working patiently toward understanding. The stars shine, the Mesopotamians watched, and slowly, carefully, brilliantly, they figured out how the sky works. Whether anyone helped them, that remains hidden, remains unclear, remains the question that astronomical achievement raises but doesn't answer. Hidden in the creation narratives, embedded in myths about human origin, lies the most radical claim of ancient astronaut theory, that we were made, modified, engineered, that the Anunnaki took existing hominids, perhaps Homo erectus, and changed them genetically, enhanced them, created Homo sapiens through deliberate intervention, through technology, through genetic manipulation that Bronze Age humans couldn't have understood, and so described as gods moulding clay, as divine breath giving life, as creation from earth and blood, the metaphors hiding technological reality, the myths preserving memory of biological engineering. The primary text is Atrahasis. The Akkadian epic describes how gods created humans to perform labour. The Igigi, lesser gods, were digging irrigation canals, were exhausted, were in revolt. The great gods needed solution, needed workers. So Enki, god of wisdom, proposes creation. Let Belit Ili the midwife create man. Let him bear the yoke. Let him take on the toil of the gods. The gods agree. Belit Ili takes clay, mixes it with blood of slain god, creates humans, 7 pairs, male and female, the first workers, born to serve divine purposes, to free the gods from labour they no longer wish to perform. Ancient astronaut theory reads this literally. The clay is DNA, the blood is genetic material, the mixing is genetic engineering, Enki is scientist, Belit Ili is geneticist. The creation isn't miraculous, is technological. The gods aren't supernatural, are extraterrestrial, with biology, with technology, with knowledge to modify existing species, to enhance intelligence, to create workers capable of complex tasks, to create us. The narrative, stripped of religious language, describes genetic engineering project. Alien beings modifying terrestrial primates to serve their purposes, to mine gold, to maintain infrastructure, to be useful. This is our origin, the theory claims. This is what we are, designed beings, created entities, modified by the Anunnaki for their convenience. The mainstream interpretation is different, sees mythology, sees theology, sees human attempt to understand existence through narrative. The creation story isn't history, is meaning-making, is philosophical reflection on human condition. We labour, we struggle, we serve powers beyond our control. The story explains why, gives origin for current reality, makes suffering meaningful by connecting it to cosmic purpose. We labour because we were made to labour. This isn't memory of genetic engineering. Is theological explanation for social structure, for why some rule and others serve, for why life is hard and gods are distant. The narrative serves ideological function, justifies hierarchy, explains status quo, makes oppression seem natural, ordained, part of original design. Take a breath. Rest with these interpretations. What does genetic science say? Does human DNA show evidence of modification, of engineering, of sudden enhancement that couldn't occur through natural selection? The answer is no. Human evolution is gradual, shows clear progression. Australopithecus to Homo habilis to Homo erectus to Homo heidelbergensis to Homo sapiens. Each stage transitional, each showing incremental change, brain size increasing, tool use improving, culture complexifying. But the progression is smooth, continuous, exactly what evolution predicts. No sudden jumps, no inserted sequences, no genetic markers suggesting engineering, just natural selection working over millions of years, slowly, patiently, producing humans through same processes that produced every other species. The 300,000-year date is interesting. Ancient astronaut theory claims this is when modification occurred, when the Anunnaki arrived and enhanced us, and anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, do appear around 300,000 years ago in the fossil record, in Morocco, in Ethiopia, in southern Africa. The timing matches, but anatomically modern doesn't mean suddenly modern, doesn't mean appearing from nowhere. The fossils show transition, show populations with some modern features and some archaic features, show gradual change, not sudden creation. The appearance of Homo sapiens isn't sharp boundary, is fuzzy transition over tens of thousands of years, is exactly what natural evolution produces, not what engineering would produce. Engineering would create sharp distinction, clear before and after, clean modification. Evolution creates blur, creates populations in transition, creates the messy gradual change we actually see in fossil record. Perhaps the most telling evidence is genetic diversity. If humans were created by engineering 300,000 years ago, if we all descend from modified population, we'd show genetic bottleneck, reduced diversity, limited variation, because we all traced a small engineered group. But human genetic diversity is substantial, shows we've been around as large population for hundreds of thousands of years, shows we never went through severe bottleneck, never reduced to tiny engineered group. The diversity argues for natural population, for continuous existence, for gradual evolution, not sudden creation. The genetics don't support the engineering hypothesis, don't show the signatures modification would leave, just show population evolving naturally over time. The other hominids complicate the picture. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi. These species existed alongside Homo sapiens, overlapped in time, sometimes interbred. If Anunnaki were engineering humans, why multiple hominid species? Why not just one? Why allow Neanderthals to persist for hundreds of thousands of years if the goal was creating workers? The diversity of hominids makes sense if evolution is driving speciation. Different populations adapting to different environments, splitting and diverging and occasionally reconnecting. This is natural process. This is how evolution works. But it doesn't fit the engineering narrative, doesn't fit the idea of deliberate creation for specific purpose, fits random natural variation, fits evolution, not design. So where does the creation story come from? If not from memory of actual engineering, perhaps from human psychology. We experience ourselves as different from animals, more conscious, more capable, more special, and we want explanation for that specialness. Natural selection provides explanation, but it's not emotionally satisfying. Doesn't make us feel special, makes us feel like accident, like random outcome of impersonal process. So we create stories that make us deliberate, intentional, designed, created by gods or aliens who chose to make us, who wanted us, who gave us purpose. The creation myths aren't memories. Our wishes are the stories we tell because they give meaning, because they make existence feel less random, less accidental, less like fortunate outcome of blind evolutionary forces, and more like intended result of conscious decision. The hidden dimension here isn't genetic modification, isn't technological intervention in human evolution, is human need for meaning, human desire to be special, to be chosen, to be created rather than evolved. The myths serve that need, provide that meaning. Whether they describe actual events, that's secondary. What matters is they make us feel our existence is purposeful, intentional, that we're here because someone wanted us here. The Atrahasis creation story, whether Mesopotamian theology or ancient astronaut memory, provides purpose, provides meaning, provides the feeling of being chosen, made, special. And perhaps that's what hidden beneath the genetic claim. Not evidence of engineering, but evidence of human psychology, of our need to believe we're more than accident, more than random outcome, more than natural variation. We need to believe we were made, whether by gods or aliens, whether through clay and blood or through genetic engineering. The mechanism matters less than the meaning, the being chosen, the being created deliberately, the having purpose that transcends simple survival. That's what the creation stories give us. That's what's hidden in the narratives. Not memory of modification, but hope that we matter, that we're special, that someone, somewhere decided we should exist and made it so. Hidden in the archaeological record, hidden in what remains, is something else. Something unexpected. Absence. The evidence that should exist if the Anunnaki walked among humans in Sumer. The traces that physical presence would inevitably leave. The artifacts, the structures, the residues that beings living in cities for centuries would produce. The silence where sound should be. The emptiness where presence should register. The gap between claim and evidence that grows more obvious the more carefully we look. If beings walked among humans, if they inhabited temples, if they received daily offerings and spoke with priests and involved themselves in human affairs, they should have left bones. Bodies decay. Even gods must die eventually, or leave, or be buried. And burial leaves traces, graves, remains, skeletons that show anatomical differences, that reveal they weren't human. That proved through physical structure they came from elsewhere, had different biology, different origin. The tombs of Sumerian kings exist. We've found them, excavated them, analysed the remains, all human, all Homo sapiens. No anomalies, no non-human skeletons, no physical evidence of beings that looked different, had different proportions, different skull structures, different anything. Just humans, thousands of human burials, 0 Anunnaki burials. The silence is profound. If they used technology, if they possessed capabilities beyond Bronze Age humans, they should have left tools, artifacts, objects made from materials or with techniques that Mesopotamians didn't have. Metals that require advanced smelting, alloys that need precise temperature control, instruments that imply optical or electronic knowledge. Something, anything. That shows technological sophistication beyond what human culture had achieved. But excavations find Bronze Age technology, copper, bronze, gold, silver, worked with techniques explainable by human capability. Sophisticated techniques, yes. Impressive craftsmanship, absolutely. But nothing that requires outside help. Nothing that shows knowledge beyond what patient human development could achieve. The tools are human tools. The materials are human materials. The techniques are human techniques. The technology is thoroughly, entirely, explicably human. The Atrahasis creation story, whether Mesopotamian theology or ancient astronaut memory, provides purpose, provides meaning, provides the feeling of being chosen, made, special. And perhaps that's what hidden beneath the genetic claim, not evidence of engineering, but evidence of human psychology, of our need to believe we're more than accident, more than random outcome. The temples should show something, if gods inhabited them, if they were physically present, if they used the spaces for more than symbolic residence. There should be traces, wear patterns that suggest use, modifications that suggest non-human needs, facilities that make sense for different biology, something in the architecture, in the layout, in the details, that says, this space was designed for beings who weren't human. But temples show human design, doorways human-sized, stairs human-proportioned, rooms arranged for human ritual, storage for human-consumed goods, everything scaled to human needs, human bodies, human practices. If the Anunnaki used these spaces, they either perfectly matched human proportions or adapted completely to human architecture. Both possible, but both convenient for explaining absence of evidence. Take a breath. Let that absence settle. The writing is human. Cuneiform develops over centuries, shows clear evolution. Earliest forms are pictographic, images representing objects. Gradually, those images simplify, become abstract, become the wedge-shaped marks that can express not just objects but sounds, syllables, complete language. The development is documented, step by step, generation by generation. No sudden appearance, no gifting of complete system. Just humans inventing writing to solve practical problems, starting simple, becoming complex, learning through trial and error, refining over centuries. If the Anunnaki taught writing, if they gave the system to humans, why the developmental period? Why the gradual evolution? Why not give complete system immediately? The evidence shows human invention, shows the messy, uncertain progress of people figuring things out for themselves, not the clean efficiency of receiving complete system from teachers who already have it. The mathematics is similar, shows development, starts with counting tokens, evolves to numerical tablets, eventually develops into sophisticated mathematics. Sexagesimal system, base 60. This is brilliant innovation. Allows for easy division, supports astronomical calculations, but it develops, shows progression, shows humans experimenting, trying different approaches, settling on what works. If Anunnaki taught mathematics, why the developmental phase? Why the false starts? Why not just give humans the efficient system immediately? The archaeological record shows the math developing, shows the learning process, shows humans getting better at calculations through practice and innovation, shows exactly what you'd expect if mathematics was human achievement, not what you'd expect if it was taught by advanced beings. Perhaps most telling is the continuity with surrounding cultures. Sumer doesn't exist in isolation, doesn't show sudden appearance of capabilities no neighbors possess. The region is part of larger network. Ideas flow, technologies spread, innovations appear in multiple places simultaneously or in sequence that shows transmission. Sumer is sophisticated, advanced, impressive, but not inexplicably so, not disconnected from regional development, not showing capabilities that require outside explanation. The advancement is regional, is shared across multiple cultures, is part of human development in the ancient Near East, not unique Sumerian mystery, not evidence of special relationship with extraterrestrial teachers, just part of broader pattern of human innovation during the period when agriculture and urbanization create conditions for complexity to flourish. The silence of absence isn't proof. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, as the saying goes. Just because we haven't found Anunnaki remains doesn't mean they weren't there. Perhaps they took their dead with them. Perhaps their technology degraded completely. Perhaps they were careful to leave no physical trace. Perhaps they existed in ways that don't register archaeologically. All possible, all explaining why evidence is absent. But each explanation requires assumption, requires special pleading, requires explaining why expected evidence doesn't exist, rather than simply accepting that absence suggests what it appears to suggest, that physical presence leaves physical traces. And absence of traces suggests absence of presence. The archaeological record is rich, detailed, thousands of sites excavated, hundreds of thousands of artifacts analyzed, millions of tablets read. The effort has been thorough, professional, sustained over more than a century. And in all that work, all that excavation, all that analysis, the evidence found is thoroughly human, shows human achievement, human development, human creativity and persistence and gradual accumulation of knowledge. The gods appear in texts, in art, in religious imagination, but not in the physical record, not in bones or tools or architecture or anything that proves they walked among humans as physical beings rather than as theological concepts. The silence might be the answer, might be what the evidence is telling us, that the Anunnaki walked in human imagination, in human belief, in human religious experience, but not in physical space, not in the streets of Ur and Uruk, not in the temples and palaces, not among the crowds and markets and daily life of Sumerian civilization. The absence is hidden in plain sight, is obvious when you look for what should be there but isn't, is the gap between ancient testimony and modern verification, between what texts claim and what archaeology finds, between belief and evidence, between the gods humans worshipped and the traces physical gods would leave. The silence persists, the absence remains, and perhaps, quietly, patiently, that silence is speaking, saying what evidence says through absence, that the Anunnaki lived in stories, in faith, in the human capacity for creating meaning through narrative, but not in Sumer, not physically, not in ways that matter to archaeologists looking for proof of claims made 4,000 years ago by people who believed what they believed but might have been wrong. The hidden dimension might be our willingness to accept that ancient peoples could be sincere and mistaken simultaneously, could believe deeply in gods who weren't there, could build civilizations around deities who existed in imagination but not in fact. The silence says perhaps, says maybe, says the question remains open, but the evidence, or lack of it, leans one direction, toward human achievement, toward natural development, toward us having done it ourselves, without help, without teachers, without gods or aliens walking among us, just humans, impressive humans, creative humans, doing what humans do, building, believing, creating both civilization and the narratives that make civilization meaningful. The silence speaks, if we're willing to listen. The question that echoes through every translation, every excavation, every careful reading of the texts is this: what were the Anunnaki? Some scholars believe the answer is straightforward, theological. The Anunnaki were gods in a polytheistic religion, divine beings imagined by ancient peoples to explain existence, to organize cosmic order, to give meaning to forces beyond human control. This interpretation has weight, has consensus, has the support of mainstream Assyriology and ancient Near Eastern studies. The Anunnaki were not aliens, were not physical visitors, were deities, members of the Mesopotamian pantheon, real to believers, yes, but real in the way religious beings are real, in faith, in practice, in the structures of meaning that religion provides, not in physical space, not in material evidence, not in ways that archaeology can verify. This scholarly view is grounded in context, in understanding how ancient religions work. The Mesopotamians were polytheistic, believed in many gods, each with specific roles, specific domains, specific relationships to other gods and to humans. The Anunnaki fit this pattern, are described as offspring of An, as divine judges, as members of the council that decrees fate. These are theological functions, religious roles, part of the conceptual structure through which Mesopotamians understood how cosmos operates. Who governs what? Why things happen as they do? The Anunnaki weren't separate from this system, were integral to it, were part of the theological framework that organized Mesopotamian religious life for 3 millennia. Scholars point to comparative evidence. Other ancient cultures had similar structures, divine councils, multiple gods, beings who mediate between supreme deities and humans. Greek mythology has minor gods and demigods. Hindu tradition has multiple levels of divine beings. Deva, Asura, various classifications. Celtic, Norse, Egyptian, almost every polytheistic tradition has hierarchies, has major gods and minor gods, has beings who serve specific functions in cosmic order. The Anunnaki aren't unique, aren't mysterious, are Mesopotamian version of pattern that appears cross-culturally, not because different cultures remembered same aliens, but because human religious imagination works in similar ways, creates similar structures, organizes the divine realm hierarchically, because humans organize everything hierarchically. The pattern is psychological, cultural, universal to human meaning-making, not evidence of shared extraterrestrial memory. The texts themselves support this reading. When Mesopotamian scribes write about the Anunnaki, they write in religious language, use theological vocabulary, describe divine actions, divine decisions, divine relationships. The texts aren't historical records, aren't scientific descriptions, are religious literature. Myths, hymns, prayers, ritual instructions, reading them as history, as documentation of actual events, that's category error. That's treating religious text as if it's archaeological report, as if metaphor is literal, as if theology is journalism. The scholars say, these are religious documents describing religious beliefs. We should read them religiously, should understand the Anunnaki as the Mesopotamians understood them, as gods, as divine beings, as members of the pantheon who govern aspects of existence, not as extraterrestrials, not as ancient astronauts, not as physical beings who walked on Earth in ways that would leave archaeological evidence. Take a breath. Rest with this interpretation. Perhaps most importantly, scholars emphasize sophistication. Mesopotamian religion was sophisticated, developed, philosophically complex. The myths weren't naive explanations by simple-minded primitives, were complex theological statements, explored questions of existence, meaning, relationship between divine and human. The creation narratives weren't primitive science, were meditations on human condition, on why we labor, why we suffer, why we're mortal. The flood narratives weren't garbled memories of actual events, were theological reflections on divine justice, on human sin, on the possibility of new beginnings. Reading these texts requires understanding their theological purpose, their philosophical depth, their role in religious system that sustained civilization for thousands of years. Some scholars acknowledge the texts are puzzling, admit there are details that seem concrete, specific, historical. The measurements in flood stories, the locations named in creation myths, the numbers in king lists. These details could be, some admit, memories of actual events elaborated into mythology. But even if that's true, even if some kernel of historical memory underlies the myths, that doesn't make the myths historical. Doesn't mean the Anunnaki were literally present. Could mean humans experienced something, floods, migrations, contact with advanced cultures, and processed those experiences through religious framework, turned history into theology, made events into myths. This happens, is documented, is how oral tradition works. Historical events become legendary. Legendary events become mythological. Mythological events become theological. The process doesn't preserve history accurately, transforms it, makes it serve religious purposes, gives it meaning beyond factual accuracy. The scholarly consensus is, the Anunnaki were gods, period. Not aliens described in pre-scientific language, not extraterrestrials remembered in mythology. Gods, beings believed in by ancient Mesopotamians, worshipped, honored, given offerings, described in elaborate theological systems, real to believers, absolutely. But real as religious beings are real, in faith, in practice, in the meanings and structures religion provides. Not real as physical beings who walked streets and left bones and used technology. The texts describe religious beliefs. We should read them as such, should understand them religiously, should not impose modern frameworks, ancient astronauts, genetic engineering, space travel, onto texts that were never meant to describe those things. The Anunnaki walked in human religious imagination, in the sacred narratives that gave meaning to Mesopotamian civilization. That's where they existed. That's where they were real. That's where, scholars say, we should look for them, not in archaeology, not in physical evidence, but in understanding ancient religion on its own terms, in taking seriously what ancient peoples believed while recognizing that belief and historical fact aren't the same, that religious truth and archaeological truth operate differently, that the Anunnaki can be theologically meaningful without being physically present, can be real to believers without being real to archaeologists. This is the scholarly position, grounded, careful, respectful of ancient religion while maintaining distinction between faith and fact, between what people believed and what actually happened. The Anunnaki were gods, and that, scholars say, is answer enough. The question remains for others. What if the scholars are wrong? What if the texts preserve more than theology? What if the Anunnaki were physical beings, extraterrestrial visitors, and the myths are garbled but genuine memories of contact? Some researchers believe this interpretation fits the evidence better, explains more, accounts for details that theological reading dismisses as metaphor or elaboration. The ancient astronaut theory isn't fringe speculation, has detailed framework, has explanations for Sumerian civilization's sudden appearance, for astronomical knowledge, for creation narratives that describe genetic engineering in theological language. The theory says, read the texts literally. Take the claims seriously. The Anunnaki were real beings, came from elsewhere, walked among humans, and when they left, humans preserved the memory in the only language they had, religious language, mythological frameworks. But beneath the religious overlay, the core is historical, is memory, is contact. This interpretation points to rapidity. Sumerian civilization appears quickly, too quickly, some say. Agriculture develops over millennia. Cities appear in centuries. Writing emerges in Uruk around 3400 BCE. Within 300 years, it's sophisticated, complex, capable of expressing abstract concepts. The ancient astronaut view says this is too fast, requires explanation, requires something beyond natural development, perhaps teaching, perhaps intervention by beings who already possessed writing, who showed humans how to record language, who gave technology that accelerated development, made possible what would have taken millennia if humans worked alone. The rapidity is evidence, is the signature of outside help, is what you'd expect if advanced beings were present, guiding, teaching, sharing knowledge. The astronomical sophistication supports this reading. The Mesopotamians knew too much, the theory claims, tracked planets too accurately, calculated eclipses too precisely, understood celestial mechanics too well for naked eye observation alone. Perhaps they had help, perhaps teachers showed them what to look for, how to calculate which cycles mattered. The ancient astronaut interpretation suggests the astronomy was gifted, given by beings who came from space and naturally understood celestial mechanics, who taught humans to watch the sky not just for practical reasons but to understand we're part of cosmic system, part of something larger. The teaching explains the sophistication, explains why Mesopotamian astronomy was so advanced so early, why it took other cultures millennia to reach similar understanding. The creation narratives are strongest evidence, advocates say. Read Atrahasis literally. Humans created by mixing clay and blood. Clay is DNA. Blood is genetic material. The mixing is engineering. The gods who do this aren't supernatural, are biological scientists, with technology to modify existing species. The narrative describes genetic engineering in the only language Bronze Age people had, theological language, divine action. But strip away the religious framework and what remains is description of biological modification, of taking existing hominids and enhancing them, creating workers, creating us. The ancient astronaut reading says, this is memory, garbled by transmission through cultures that didn't understand genetics, theologized by societies that interpreted everything through religious lens, but fundamentally, at core, historical, describing actual events, actual intervention, actual creation through technology the witnesses couldn't comprehend. Perhaps most compelling to believers is the cross-cultural pattern, flood myths worldwide, creation stories describing gods making humans from clay or earth, traditions of sky beings descending and teaching civilization. These patterns appear in cultures with no contact, no shared history, no way to borrow from each other. The ancient astronaut view says this isn't coincidence, isn't independent invention of similar stories, is shared memory, different cultures preserving different aspects of same events. The Anunnaki weren't just in Mesopotamia, were global, appeared to multiple cultures, left similar impressions, similar memories, similar stories about beings from sky who taught and then departed. The universality is evidence, is what you'd expect if contact was real. If multiple cultures experienced similar interventions and preserved memories in their own mythological languages. Take a breath. Let this possibility settle. The theory also addresses absence of evidence, says we're looking wrong, expecting wrong things. If the Anunnaki were advanced, if they had technology far beyond Bronze Age humans, they wouldn't leave traces we'd recognize. Their tools would degrade completely or be taken when they left. Their bodies would be removed, not buried in Mesopotamia. Their architecture would look human-scaled because they were humanoid, similar enough to us that buildings worked for both. The absence doesn't disprove presence, just shows they were careful, or that their presence was temporary, or that our archaeological methods aren't designed to detect what they left. We're looking for conventional evidence, but advanced beings wouldn't leave conventional traces, wouldn't make mistakes that let primitive humans find proof millennia later. The absence is explained, is accounted for, is compatible with presence if presence was sufficiently advanced or sufficiently careful. Some ancient astronaut researchers are careful, acknowledge the theory is speculative, admit the evidence is ambiguous, admit mainstream interpretation might be correct. But they say, the question deserves asking, the possibility deserves consideration, the texts are strange enough, the civilization sophisticated enough, the patterns universal enough, that dismissing ancient astronaut interpretation as pseudoscience is premature, is closing inquiry before fully exploring alternatives. Maybe the Anunnaki were gods, or maybe they were extraterrestrials described in religious language by people who didn't have scientific vocabulary. Maybe the myths are theology, or maybe their history theologized. Maybe we're alone, or maybe we weren't always. Maybe contact happened and we forgot or reinterpreted or mythologized what we couldn't understand. The theory stays open to possibilities. Mainstream scholarship closes prematurely. We may never know for certain. The evidence is too old, too ambiguous, too filtered through cultural frameworks we don't fully understand. But ancient astronaut theory refuses to accept that the question is settled, refuses to agree that gods is the only answer, insists the texts could mean more, could preserve more, could be pointing toward truth mainstream interpretation misses by assuming ancient peoples were less literal, less historical, less accurate than they might have been. The theory says, take them at their word. If they said gods walked among them, maybe gods did. And if gods did, maybe gods were something we'd recognize not as supernatural but as extraterrestrial, as physical beings from elsewhere using technology we'd interpret as divine power if we were Bronze Age humans encountering it. The ancient astronaut interpretation isn't rejection of scholarship. Is alternative reading? Is possibility that remains open? Is question that won't quite close because the mystery is too deep, too interesting, too important? If it's true, if the Anunnaki really walked among humans in Sumer, if we're created beings, if contact happened and shaped our development, that changes everything, changes who we are, changes what we are, changes how we understand ourselves. And that possibility, however unlikely mainstream scholarship says it is, that possibility is worth preserving, worth exploring, worth keeping alive in the space between evidence and interpretation, between what we know and what we wonder, between the texts that speak and the silence that neither confirms nor denies what they claim. The civilization fell, as all do. Sumer collapsed. Akkad rose and fell. Babylon flourished and faded. The cities were abandoned. The temples crumbled. The irrigation systems failed. Sand covered the ruins. The languages died, ceased being spoken, became marks on tablets no one could read. Sumerian was dead by 2000 BCE. Akkadian followed centuries later. The cuneiform script, used for 3,000 years, was forgotten. The last person who could read it died sometime in the early centuries CE, and for nearly 2 millennia, silence. The tablets sat in ruins. The gods were forgotten, the Anunnaki, whether they walked among humans or existed only in belief, passed from memory. The story seemed lost, ended, buried beneath sand and time and the accumulated forgetting that erases even the greatest civilizations. But memory has its own architecture. Stories persist in strange ways. The Hebrew Bible preserved echoes. Genesis describes creation from clay, describes flood that covered earth, describes tower built to reach heaven. These are Mesopotamian stories, borrowed, adapted, theologized through monotheistic framework, but recognizably descended from Sumerian and Akkadian narratives. The Jews encountered Mesopotamian culture during Babylonian exile, 6th century BCE. They heard the stories, absorbed them, brought them home, wove them into their own scriptures, and through Jewish tradition, through Christianity and Islam that built on Jewish foundation, the Mesopotamian narratives survived, changed, transformed, but alive, transmitted, carried forward in texts that never stopped being read, never stopped being copied, never stopped shaping how billions understand creation and flood and human relationship with divine. Greek historians preserved fragments. Berossus, Babylonian priest writing in 3rd century BCE, recorded Mesopotamian traditions in Greek. His work is mostly lost, but later historians quoted him, preserved pieces, references to ancient kings, to flood survivors, to beings who came from the sea to teach civilization. The transmission was broken, fragmentary, but not completely severed. Some memory persisted, some knowledge continued, enough that when cuneiform was finally deciphered, when the actual Mesopotamian texts could be read again, scholars recognized connections, saw that later traditions preserved genuine echoes of older stories, confirmed that memory, however distorted, can survive millennia. The rediscovery began in the 19th century. Archaeologists descended on Mesopotamia, British, French, German, American, excavating tells, finding tablets by the thousands, shipping them to museums in London, Paris, Berlin. But the tablets were unreadable. Cuneiform was dead language in dead script. The marks were mysterious, beautiful, but meaningless, until scholars began to crack the code. Henry Rawlinson copying the Behistun inscription. Multiple languages carved on cliff face in Persia. Same text in Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian. The Rosetta Stone of cuneiform. Working from known Persian, scholars could decode Akkadian, and from Akkadian, eventually, Sumerian. The languages spoke again. The silence broke. After 2,000 years, the tablets revealed their contents. George Smith's discovery in 1872 was watershed. Young assistant at British Museum, sorting through Assyrian tablets from Nineveh, finding flood narrative, reading about Utnapishtim and boat and dove and raven, recognizing it paralleled Genesis. The Victorian world was shocked. Biblical flood had Mesopotamian sources, was part of older tradition. The discovery validated archaeology, validated the tablets as historical sources, proved they contained real information, real narratives, real memory of ancient beliefs. The floodgates opened. Metaphorically, scholars rushed to translate more, to read what Mesopotamians had written about themselves, to hear their voices after millennia of silence. Take a breath. Feel that reconnection. Even now, 150 years later, the work continues. Thousands of tablets remain untranslated, sitting in museum storage, uncatalogued, unread. The task is enormous. The texts are difficult, require expertise in dead languages, in fragmentary contexts, in reference systems we don't fully understand. But slowly, patiently, scholars work. Each translation adds understanding. Each text reveals more about how Mesopotamians lived, thought, believed. The Anunnaki appear in newly translated texts, sometimes mentioned casually, sometimes described in detail. Each reference adds to picture, clarifies roles, shows variations across time and region. The story of the Anunnaki is still being written, still being reconstructed from clay fragments pressed 4,000 years ago. Still today, archaeologists excavate Mesopotamian sites. Though work is harder now, Iraq has faced decades of conflict. Sites have been looted, access restricted. The war on terror, the Gulf Wars, the regional instability, all have interrupted archaeological work. Some sites were damaged, some artifacts destroyed, some knowledge lost again after being preserved for millennia. But when conditions allow, excavation resumes. New techniques, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, chemical analysis, reveal things earlier archaeologists missed, show patterns invisible to traditional excavation, find sites buried too deep for 19th century methods. The rediscovery continues. The Earth still gives up secrets, still offers answers, still preserves what humans created and believed and recorded in media that endures when flesh and wood and textile decay. The question of the Anunnaki has evolved, changed, taken on new dimensions. In the 1960s and 70s, Erich von Däniken and others popularized ancient astronaut theory, read Mesopotamian texts through lens of space age, saw spacecraft in divine descent, saw genetic engineering in creation myths, saw extraterrestrial contact in stories about gods. The interpretation was new, radical, controversial, but it tapped into something, into human wondering about whether we're alone, into the appeal of thinking ancient peoples knew more than we credit, into desire for cosmic connection, for meaning that extends beyond Earth. The ancient astronaut reading of Mesopotamian texts became cultural phenomenon. Books, documentaries, television series. The theory reached millions, shaped how popular culture understands ancient civilizations, made the Anunnaki household name outside academic circles. Scholars pushed back, defended mainstream interpretations, wrote rebuttals, explained why ancient astronaut theory misreads evidence, imposes modern frameworks on ancient texts, mistakes metaphor for literalism. But the debate itself is interesting, is legacy. The Mesopotamian texts, 4,000 years old, still generate passionate disagreement, still matter enough to fight over, still provoke wonder and speculation and competing interpretations. The Anunnaki, whether gods or aliens or theological constructs, still have power, still command attention, still make people ask fundamental questions about human origins and development and relationship with forces beyond ourselves. Perhaps that's the real legacy, not whether the Anunnaki walked among humans in Sumer, but that the question persists, that we're still asking, still wondering, still trying to understand what ancient peoples meant when they wrote about divine beings, still grappling with the ambiguity between belief and fact, between religious truth and historical truth, between what people experienced and what they described. The texts have survived. The question has survived. And we, their distant descendants, their cultural inheritors, we carry the wondering forward. We read the tablets. We excavate the ruins. We debate the meanings. We keep the Anunnaki alive, whether they ever lived or not. by continuing to care about the question, by refusing to let it settle into easy certainty, by maintaining space for mystery, for ambiguity, for multiple possible answers. The stars that watched Sumerian priests make offerings to the Anunnaki, those stars still shine, barely changed in position, the same sky, the same celestial reference points, the same cosmos the Mesopotamians studied with such dedication. And beneath those stars, humans still wonder, still look up, still ask whether we're alone, whether gods walk among us, whether the beings ancient peoples described as divine were something we'd recognize as extraterrestrial if we encountered them. The wondering is human, universal, eternal, connects us to the Sumerians who wondered before us, who looked at same stars and asked similar questions, who created narratives to express their understanding or their uncertainty about existence and meaning and relationship with whatever forces govern the universe. The legacy we inherit isn't answers, is questions, is the tablets that speak without quite clarifying, is the ruins that suggest without quite proving, is the ambiguity that allows multiple interpretations, multiple readings, multiple understandings of what the Anunnaki were and whether they walked among humans. We inherit the freedom to wonder, to speculate, to believe or doubt or remain suspended between. We inherit the texts themselves, preserved through millennia, available to anyone who wants to read them, to form their own conclusions, to join the conversation that spans 4,000 years. The Anunnaki, real or imagined, physical or theological, walk still, in human wondering, in human questioning, in the space between evidence and belief where the most interesting mysteries dwell. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the question is the legacy, the wondering is the inheritance. The ambiguity is the gift, because certainty closes inquiry. But mystery keeps it open, keeps us looking, keeps us reading, keeps us connected to the ancient peoples who asked before us and the future peoples who will ask after us. The question continues, the wondering persists, and you, listening now, you're part of it, part of the legacy, part of the long human tradition of looking at evidence and wondering what it means, of hearing ancient voices and trying to understand what they're saying, of living with uncertainty while refusing to stop asking. The story isn't over, hasn't ended, continues in us, in you, in everyone who wonders whether gods walked, whether the Anunnaki were real, whether we're alone or were never alone. The tablets wait, the question waits, and the wondering, patient, persistent, eternal, continues. And so we return, back to this moment, back to wherever you are now, listening to this, feeling whatever supports you, back to the present, which is all any of us truly inhabit. The journey through ancient Sumer is complete. The tablets have spoken, the temples have been explored, the question has been asked, and here we are, still wondering, still uncertain, still holding the mystery without needing to resolve it. The clay tablets rest in museums, behind glass, climate-controlled, protected from the decay that claimed so much else. The cuneiform marks are faint in places, the clay is fragile, cracks run through some pieces, but they endure. They've outlasted the civilization that created them, outlasted the languages they were written in, outlasted the gods they describe. The tablets are patient, have been patient for 4,000 years, will be patient for 4,000 more. They speak to anyone willing to learn their language, to anyone willing to sit with ambiguity, to anyone willing to read without demanding certainty. The tablets don't insist on single interpretation, don't close the question, just preserve the words, the names, the stories, the beliefs of people long dead whose wondering was not so different from ours. The ruins wait beneath Iraqi soil, Uruk, Eridu, the tells that mark ancient cities, the mounds of broken brick and accumulated centuries. Most remain unexcavated, most hold their secrets still. Archaeology is slow work, patient work, and there's more buried than can ever be uncovered, more tablets than can ever be translated, more sites than can ever be explored. The earth is generous with its mysteries, doesn't release them easily, doesn't give up all answers, just offers fragments, pieces. Enough to know something was there, enough to wonder what it was, enough to keep the questions alive across the gulf of time that separates us from those who built the cities and worshipped in the temples and wrote about the Anunnaki in clay that outlasted empires. Take a breath. Rest here. Perhaps the deepest truth is this. We don't know. Can't know. Won't know with certainty whether the Anunnaki walked among humans in Sumer. The evidence is too old, too filtered through belief systems we don't fully understand, too ambiguous to support definitive conclusions. The texts say one thing, the archaeology says another, or says nothing, or says something that could mean many things. The silence where evidence should be, that could mean absence, or could mean we're looking wrong, asking wrong questions, expecting wrong things. The uncertainty is irreducible, is the honest position, is what the evidence actually supports when we're humble enough to admit what we don't know. And perhaps that's acceptable. Perhaps not knowing is the natural state. Perhaps mystery is more truthful than certainty when certainty requires ignoring ambiguity. The Sumerians believed the Anunnaki were real, were present, were involved in human affairs. That belief was real, shaped how they lived, shaped what they built, shaped the civilization they created. Whether the belief corresponded to physical reality, whether gods walked or were imagined, the belief itself was powerful, was real in its effects, made Sumer what it was, made the temples rise, made the offerings flow, made the system work for thousands of years. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the question of physical presence is less important than the question of what belief enables, what it creates, what it makes possible when humans organize around it. The stars overhead are the same stars Sumerian astronomers tracked, barely shifted, the patterns they identified, the zodiac they created. We still use, still recognize, still mark time by. The sky connects us, makes us contemporaries across 4,000 years, makes us fellow wanderers beneath same celestial display. The Sumerians looked up and saw order, saw pattern, saw evidence of divine intelligence organizing cosmos. We look up and see physics, see gravity and fusion and the mechanics of planetary motion, different frameworks, different understandings, but same sky, same human impulse to make sense of what we observe, to find meaning in patterns, to ask whether we're alone, whether the lights above know we're here, whether consciousness exists beyond Earth. The wondering hasn't changed, just the language we use to express it. The Anunnaki might be ancient astronauts now instead of gods, but the question is the same. Are we alone? Were we ever alone? Does someone watch? Does anyone care? Perhaps what matters most is that we're still asking, still reading the tablets, still excavating the ruins, still caring enough about ancient peoples to try understanding what they believed. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, have survived because we keep them alive. Keep reading about them, keep wondering, keep debating, keep the question open. They exist now, as they perhaps always existed, in human consciousness, in human wondering, in the space between belief and skepticism where the most interesting mysteries live, where certainty hasn't killed curiosity, where ambiguity is gift rather than frustration, where not knowing keeps us looking, reading, thinking, connecting with the ancient world through the questions we share. The wind still moves across the Mesopotamian plain, across the tells that mark where cities stood, across the sand that covers ruins, across the empty places where temples rose and fell and rose and fell and finally fell for the last time. The wind is patient, has witnessed everything, the building and the destroying, the believing and the doubting, the presence or absence of gods. The wind doesn't judge, doesn't take sides, just moves, just carries dust, just erodes what remains standing and deposits what it carries elsewhere. The wind is time made visible, is change, is the force that makes everything temporary, even questions, even mysteries, even the wondering that feels eternal but is just human. Just our brief moment asking what we ask before we too become dust the wind carries. The clay waits, the ruins wait, the question waits, and somewhere, in the stillness between knowing and not knowing, between belief and skepticism, between what ancient peoples claimed and what modern evidence shows, the Anunnaki wait too, not in temples, not in physical space, but in the mystery itself, in the ambiguity that allows them to be both real and imagined simultaneously, both historical and mythological, both present and absent, both gods and aliens and theological constructs and all of it and none of it and something we don't have words for yet, The waiting is patience, is the patience of clay that outlasts civilizations, the patience of stars that outlast species, the patience of questions that outlast answers. Perhaps you'll form your own conclusion. Perhaps you'll decide the Anunnaki walked or didn't walk, were real or weren't real. Perhaps you'll remain suspended, as I do, in the uncertainty. Either way, you've been here. You've wondered with me. You've explored the evidence and the interpretations and the gaps between them. You've touched the mystery without demanding it resolve. You've honoured the ancient peoples by taking their claims seriously. Whether you believe them or not, that's enough. That's what the legacy asks. Not certainty, just engagement, just curiosity, just willingness to wonder. The night deepens wherever you are. The stars turn in their ancient patterns. The clay rests in its silence. The question persists in its ambiguity. If you found something here tonight, some connection to what endures, subscribe to continue. There are more lost worlds waiting, more silence that speaks, more nights like this one. And in that stillness, in that patient, uncertain, wondering space, the story continues, not toward answer, but toward more wondering, more questioning, more beautiful, uncertain stillness.